Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this quiet evening together, where the world outside fades softly into shadow and stillness. Tonight, we journey to Victorian London, to the familiar comforts of 221B Baker Street, where a mystery awaits, not one of violence or dread, but of whispered legends, ancient sorrows, and the gentle unravelling of secrets long buried beneath winter's blanket. This story is crafted for those seeking rest, for minds that need permission to slow, for hearts that crave the comforting rhythm of a tale told beside a crackling fire. Let this narrative wash over you like warm tea. Let the words become a soft pillow upon which your thoughts may rest. There is no urgency here, no demand upon your attention, only an invitation to drift, to dream, and to find peace in the mysterious beauty of a winter's night. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're nestled beneath blankets in a quiet room, or perhaps you're watching the stars through a frosted window. Wherever you are, know that this space is yours, a sanctuary from the hurried world. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain arrives first as a whisper, then as a confession, tapping against the tall windows of 229 Baker Street with the patient insistence of someone bearing news that cannot wait, yet knows the value of a gentle approach. Each droplet catches the amber glow of the gas lamps lining the street below, transforming them into tiny jewels that slide down the glass, merging and separating in patterns that might mean something to a mind trained in observation, or might simply be the beautiful chaos of a December evening in London. The year is 1889, and the city wears its winter like a gentleman wears a well-tailored coat, with dignity, with a certain elegant weariness, with the accumulated character of countless seasons past. Inside the sitting room, the fire in the hearth performs its ancient dance, casting shadows that climb the walls like ivy, stretching and retreating with each shift of the burning logs. The flames are golden at their hearts, deepening to orange at their edges, occasionally flickering blue where the wood releases its final secrets. The heat radiates outward in concentric circles of comfort, pushing back against the December chill that presses against the windows, creating a sanctuary of warmth that seems almost sacred in its purposefulness. The scent of burning oak mingles with the faint trace of tobacco smoke, creating an atmosphere that speaks of contemplation, of countless evenings spent in thought, of a space where intellect and comfort have reached an understanding. Sherlock Holmes sits in his favoured chair, the one closest to the fire, its leather worn smooth by years of use, conforming to his angular frame with the familiarity of an old friend. His long fingers are steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as they stare not at anything in particular, but rather at everything at once, a state of restful alertness that characterizes his rare moments of contentment. He wears his dressing gown of deep burgundy, its fabric rich and heavy, tied loosely at the waist. His dark hair falls across his forehead in that characteristic way that suggests both careful grooming and absolute indifference to appearance, depending on one's perspective. Across from him, in the companion chair that has borne witness to so many conversations, so many shared silences, sits Dr. John Watson, his presence as much a part of the room's comfort as the fire itself. Watson holds a cup of tea between his hands, allowing the warmth to seep into his palms, his moustache occasionally catching a wisp of steam that rises from the dark liquid. His face, honest and open, bears the contentment of a man who has found his place in the world, who has weathered storms and emerged with his capacity for wonder intact. He wears a waistcoat of charcoal grey beneath a jacket of heavier wool, dressed for the season, for the possibility of being called away at a moment's notice, yet equally prepared to spend the entire evening in companionable quietude. Between them, on the small table that has served as witness stand, evidence repository, and dinner service depending on the day's requirements, sits the tea service. A pot of simple white porcelain, 2 cups and saucers of matching design, a small pitcher of cream, and a bowl containing rough-cut sugar cubes that catch the firelight like tiny amber windows. Beside these, Watson's medical bag rests against the table leg, its leather surface scuffed and weathered, bearing the marks of countless house calls, emergency summons, and adventures that began as simple consultations and evolved into something altogether more extraordinary. The clock on the mantelpiece marks the hour with a gentle chime, 8 clear notes that seem to float through the room rather than intrude upon it. The sound fades slowly, absorbed by the heavy curtains, the Persian carpet, the leather-bound volumes that line the walls in their floor-to-ceiling cases. These books stand like silent guardians of knowledge, their spines bearing titles in Latin, French, German, English, treatises on chemistry and criminal history, volumes of poetry and philosophy, reference works on every subject from medieval architecture to the mating habits of bees. The collection reflects the eclectic nature of the room's primary inhabitant, a mind that refuses to be confined by conventional categories, that finds connections between disparate fields of study that others would never think to examine in conjunction. Watson breaks the comfortable silence, his voice carrying that particular quality of warmth that comes from genuine affection and long familiarity. "Quiet evening," he observes, the words more a meditation than a conversation starter. Rather pleasant after the week's exertions. Holmes's lips curve slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement, a shared recognition of the week past. 3 cases concluded, none of them particularly taxing, but each requiring its own form of attention. A matter of stolen correspondence, a question of inheritance rights, a missing person who turned out to be not missing at all, but simply tired of being found. Cases that brought satisfaction in their resolution without the weight of tragedy. The city rests, Holmes murmurs, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey, as contemplative as a prayer. Or appears to rest. London never truly sleeps, of course. Even now, 1,000 dramas unfold in darkness, some tragic, some merely tedious, but each the centre of someone's universe. The fire shifts, settling into itself with a soft cascade of embers, and Watson rises to attend to it, selecting a fresh log from the brass holder beside the hearth. He places it with care, positioning it just so to catch the existing flames, and is rewarded with a fresh burst of light as the bark catches, crackling and popping in that primal music that has comforted humanity since the first cold night in the first dark cave. The new log releases the sweet scent of applewood, adding another layer to the room's olfactory tapestry. As Watson returns to his chair, lifting his teacup once more, his attention is drawn to the window by a change in the rain's rhythm. No longer the steady patter, but something more purposeful. The sound of a hansom cab pulling to a stop directly before their door. The jingle of harness and the snort of a horse. The creak of a step being lowered. Both men exchange glances. Watson's eyebrows rising in mild surprise, Holmes's expression sharpening with interest. "A visitor," Watson says, setting down his cup. "At this hour, in this weather. Someone for whom the matter brooks no delay," Holmes adds, already rising from his chair with that fluid grace that characterizes his movements when his interest is piqued. Yet someone who took time to dress appropriately for a formal consultation despite the urgency. Note the quality of the carriage. The driver didn't call out for direction, which means our visitor has been here before, or has done sufficient research to know precisely where to come. Footsteps sound on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's measured tread, ascending from her domain below, followed by a second set of footsteps, lighter but no less deliberate. A woman's step, Watson notes, identifying the particular rhythm. A knock comes at the door, polite but firm, and Holmes calls out permission to enter. Mrs. Hudson appears, her round face bearing that expression of professional discretion, mixed with maternal concern that she has perfected over years of managing the unusual household above her own quarters. She wears her evening shawl against the chill of the stairwell, and behind her stands a figure that immediately commands attention, not through flamboyance, but through an air of quiet dignity wrapped in obvious distress. The woman who enters is perhaps 40 years of age, though the shadows beneath her eyes and the tightness around her mouth suggest recent strain that may make her appear older than her years. She wears a travelling dress of deep forest green, its fabric expensive, but not ostentatiously so, cut in a practical style that speaks of someone who values function alongside form. Her cloak, still beaded with raindrops that catch the gaslight like scattered diamonds, is lined with fur at the collar, something dark and luxurious that suggests resources without demanding notice of them. Her hair, dark brown threaded with the first silver strands, is pulled back beneath a small hat that has weathered the journey admirably, though a few damp tendrils escape at her temples. But it is her eyes that hold the attention, deep brown, intelligent, and carrying within them something that might be fear, but manifests as determination, as the resolve of someone who has wrestled with a decision and emerged on the side of action, rather than paralysis. "Mrs. Hudson, thank you," Holmes says, dismissing their landlady with courtesy and a slight nod. Mrs. Hudson withdraws, closing the door with care, and Holmes gestures to the chair he has just vacated, the one closest to the fire. "Please, madam, sit. You've come through the rain, and whatever brings you here at such an hour deserves to be discussed in comfort." The woman moves to the chair, accepting the seat with a murmur of gratitude. Watson, ever the gentleman, retrieves a fresh cup from the sideboard and pours tea without asking, adding cream and sugar in moderate amounts, a physician's default assumption of what might provide comfort and warmth. He presents it to her with a gentle smile, and she accepts it with hands that tremble only slightly, wrapping her fingers around the cup as though drawing strength from its heat. "My name," she begins, her voice low and musical, touched with an accent that speaks of education and northern upbringing, perhaps Yorkshire, perhaps further north still, "is Eleanor Blackwood. I have come from Northumberland, a journey of considerable distance, because the matter I bring before you is one that defies both logic and belief, and I find myself caught between these two impossibilities, like a bird trapped between earth and sky." Holmes settles into Watson's chair, yielding the better position to their guest, his attention focused entirely upon her with that quality of concentration that makes the subject feel both studied and respected. Watson takes up a position standing near the mantelpiece. His role in these initial moments, one of quiet observation, medical instinct assessing their visitor for signs of illness or hysteria, while his narrative instinct begins composing the opening paragraphs of what might become another addition to his published chronicles. A poetic description, Mrs. Blackwood, Holmes observes, his tone gentle, inviting elaboration without demanding it. Logic and belief need not be enemies, though they often appear so. Please, begin wherever you feel most comfortable. The fire is warm, the night is long, and we have no appointments that cannot wait. Eleanor Blackwood sips her tea, and some of the tension eases from her shoulders, though the worry in her eyes remains undiminished. The firelight plays across her features, creating a chiaroscuro that would fascinate a painter, half her face illuminated, half in shadow, as though she herself exists between two worlds. My family, she begins again, her voice steadying as she speaks, has lived in Northumberland for 11 generations, residing in a manor house called Blackwood Hall, which stands at the edge of the Cheviot Hills, where the cultivated land gives way to wild moorland. It is beautiful country, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, beautiful and harsh in equal measure, a landscape that shapes those who live within it into something both resilient and respectful of forces beyond human control. Watson finds himself drawn into her narrative, the physician in him noting the way her breathing becomes more regular as she speaks, the act of telling her story serving as its own form of medicine. Holmes remains perfectly still, only his eyes betraying movement as they flicker across her face, her hands, the cut of her clothing, gathering data in that inexhaustible way of his. Blackwood Hall is not a cheerful place, she continues, her gaze distant now, seeing not the warm room before her, but the cold stone of her ancestral home. It was built during the reign of Elizabeth, constructed as much for defence as habitation, with thick walls and narrow windows, positioned to command a view of the surrounding country. Over the centuries, it has been expanded, softened somewhat, made more suitable for domestic life, but its bones remain those of a fortress, and there are nights when the wind comes down from the hills that one can hear it as it was meant to sound, like a warning, like a declaration that some things cannot be conquered, only endured. The rain continues its conversation with the windows, and the fire responds with soft pops and crackles, creating a rhythm that seems to support her words, to give them space to breathe and settle. For most of its history, Blackwood Hall has been home to my husband's family, not mine, she explains, though by marriage I have now lived there for 18 years, and my children were born within its walls. My husband, Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, inherited the title and estate from his father 10 years ago, and with them he inherited also the responsibility of stewardship, the tenant farms, the village that takes its name from the family, the small church where Blackwoods have been baptized, married, and buried since stone replaced wood in its construction. She pauses, lifting the teacup to her lips again, and Watson moves quietly to refresh the pot from the kettle that perpetually simmers on the hob, the small sounds of domestic routine providing a gentle punctuation to her narrative. My husband is a good man, she says, and the affection in her voice is unmistakable, genuine, scholarly, thoughtful, perhaps too sensitive for the hard pragmatism that estate management often requires, but good. His passion is history, particularly the history of our region, the borderlands between England and Scotland, those territories that have changed hands and allegiances more times than can be easily counted, where every field has witnessed conflict, and every ancient stone might mark a grave or a boundary or both. Holmes leans forward slightly, his fingers steepling once more beneath his chin. A historian, then, and has his research led him into areas that might provoke concern? Rivalries among scholars, perhaps, or discoveries that others might prefer remained hidden. Eleanor Blackwood's expression shifts, something like relief crossing her features. The relief of being understood, of speaking with someone who seeks practical explanations before supernatural ones. Yes and no, Mr. Holmes. Geoffrey's work has been published in respected journals, and he is known among his peers as meticulous and fair-minded. He has no enemies that I know of, no conflicts beyond the usual scholarly debates that remain always within the bounds of courtesy. But his most recent project... She trails off, setting down her cup with care, her hands folding in her lap with the deliberateness of someone seeking to maintain composure through physical control. 3 months ago, she resumes, her voice lower now, requiring them to lean slightly closer to catch each word. Geoffrey became fascinated with a local legend, one that older residents speak of only reluctantly, and the younger generation dismisses as superstitious nonsense, meant to frighten children. It concerns a woman, though to call her simply a woman seems inadequate, a figure known in local parlance as the Weeping Lady of Wulfstan Tor. The name hangs in the air like a conjuration, and despite the room's warmth, Watson feels a small chill trace his spine. Holmes, however, shows no such reaction, merely nodding slightly to encourage continuation. Wulfstan Tor, Eleanor explains, is a rock formation that rises from the moorland about 3 miles from Blackwood Hall, a great jutting tooth of stone that stands alone, visible for miles in every direction. It's old beyond reckoning, older than the Romans, older than the Celts, ancient when the first humans came to the region. The Tor has accumulated many names over the centuries: the Devil's Finger, the Widow's Tooth, the Standing Sentinel. But Wulfstan is the name that endured, taken from a Saxon thane who supposedly held the surrounding territory in the years before the conquest. She pauses, gathering her thoughts, and the fire chooses this moment to settle again, sending up a small shower of sparks that climb briefly toward the chimney before winking out like tiny stars extinguished. The legend, she continues, her voice taking on the particular quality of someone recounting a tale heard many times, inherited from previous generations, tells of a woman who came to the Tor during a terrible winter centuries ago. No one agrees on precisely when, though most versions place it somewhere in the medieval period. She came seeking her lost child, a daughter who had wandered into the moors during a storm and failed to return. For 3 days and 3 nights, the woman searched, calling her child's name, refusing food or shelter or any comfort. On the 4th day, she was found at the base of the Tor, frozen to death, her face turned upward toward the stone peak, her mouth open as though still calling. Watson finds himself holding his breath without realizing it, the physician's skepticism warring with the storyteller's susceptibility to atmosphere and to tragedy. Holmes remains inscrutable, though his eyes have taken on that particular gleam that Watson recognizes, the light of a mind engaged, processing, categorizing information against vast mental archives of the strange and the explicable. From that time forward, Eleanor says, or so the legend claims, the woman's spirit has haunted the tor and the surrounding moorland, manifesting particularly during the winter months, during storms, during times of impending death. She appears as a woman in pale robes, her dark hair unbound, her face beautiful but terrible in its grief. She is heard more often than seen, a wailing cry that carries across the moors, a sound that those who have heard it describe as the most sorrowful thing imaginable, a lament that seems to contain all the accumulated grief of humanity, distilled into a single, sustained note. The room feels colder now, though the fire burns as steadily as before. Watson moves slightly closer to its warmth, while Holmes remains motionless, his gaze never leaving their visitor's face. Those who hear the wailing, Eleanor continues, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, are said to be marked by the weeping lady, singled out for misfortune or death. Farmers claim that livestock who hear the cry will sicken and die within a fortnight. Children who hear it supposedly suffer nightmares from which they never fully recover. And anyone who sees the lady directly, face to face, is doomed to follow in her footsteps, to lose someone beloved, to experience grief so profound that it severs the ties binding spirit to flesh. She looks up then, meeting Holmes's gaze directly, her own eyes reflecting firelight, and something that might be tears held carefully at bay. "I know how this sounds, Mr. Holmes. I am an educated woman, a rational person who has no patience for ghost stories and superstitious nonsense. If someone had told me this tale 3 months ago, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. But I tell you now, with all the certainty I possess, that something haunts the moorland around Wolfstan Tor, and that something has taken notice of my husband." Holmes uncurls from his contemplative position, rising smoothly to his feet. He moves to the window, drawing back the curtain slightly, to look out into the rain-swept street. Though Watson suspects he sees nothing of the present London, but rather projects his mind northward, toward wild country and ancient stones and mysteries that wear the cloak of legend. "Tell us," Holmes says softly, his voice a study in encouragement without judgment, "what has occurred? Not the legend, but the specific events that have brought you on this long journey through winter rain to seek the assistance of a consulting detective." Eleanor Blackwood draws a deep breath, visibly steeling herself for the recitation. Watson moves to refill her teacup, the small service providing both men and women a moment to prepare for whatever comes next. 6 weeks ago, she begins, her narrative now chronological, anchored in specific time rather than legendary past. Geoffrey announced his intention to investigate the Weeping Lady thoroughly, to approach it not as a ghost story, but as a historical puzzle. He believed that some actual event lay buried beneath the layers of supernatural embellishment, that the legend had grown from a seed of truth that research might uncover. He began spending his days in the manor's library, poring over family records, estate documents, church registries, anything that might reference unusual deaths or disappearances during winter months, any mention of the Tor or of women fitting the legend's description. She pauses, sipping her tea, and Watson notes that her hands have steadied completely now, the act of telling, of sharing the burden, serving its therapeutic purpose. After a week of this research, she continues, Geoffrey became excited, secretive, in a way that was unlike him. He would work late into the night, papers spread across his desk, candles burning down to stubs, while he made notes in his careful hand, When I asked about his progress, he would only say that he had found something unexpected, something that connected the legend to actual historical figures, to events documented in multiple sources. He promised to share everything once he had confirmed certain details, but in the meantime, he asked me to trust his discretion. The fire cracks sharply, making Eleanor start slightly, her teacup rattling against its saucer. She sets it down, pressing her hands together in her lap. Then, 4 weeks ago, Geoffrey went to the tour itself. He set out in the morning, well before dawn, carrying his notebook and a pencil, dressed warmly against the cold. He told me he wanted to see the place with his own eyes, to walk the ground, to understand the landscape that had given birth to such a persistent legend. I was uneasy, I admit this freely, but I had no rational reason to object. The moorland is familiar territory to him. He knows every path and hollow. I expected him back by midday. Her voice tightens, and Watson sees her throat work as she swallows hard against emotion. He returned as the sun was setting, and he was changed. There is no better word for it. He walked as though uncertain of his footing, though the ground was firm. His face was pale, almost grey, and when I took his hand, it was cold despite the heavy gloves he wore. He would not speak of what he had seen or experienced. He went directly to his study, locked the door, and remained there through the night. I heard him pacing, hour after hour, the boards creaking beneath his feet in an endless rhythm that spoke of profound agitation. Holmes has turned from the window, his full attention focused once more on their visitor. And since that night, Eleanor says, her voice steady, but weighted with obvious concern, my husband has been like a man haunted. He barely eats. He sleeps only in brief snatches, waking with gasps and cries that he will not explain. He has continued his research with an obsessive intensity, working himself to exhaustion, muttering about needing to understand, about pieces that don't fit, about something he calls the pattern. And 3 times now, he has woken in the dead of night and attempted to leave the house, walking in his sleep or in some state between sleeping and waking, heading always in the same direction, toward Wulfstan Tor. Watson straightens, his medical training coming to the fore. Somnambulism, he murmurs, though the trigger remains unclear. Has your husband a history of sleepwalking? Never, Eleanor responds immediately. Geoffrey slept like a stone, peacefully through the night without stirring. This is entirely new, as alien to his nature, as if he had suddenly developed a passion for gambling or drink. And the final incident that prompted your journey here? Holmes asks, his voice gentle but inexorable, knowing there is more, that something specific has pushed concern into action. Eleanor's composure finally cracks slightly, a single tear escaping to track down her cheek, though she brushes it away impatiently, almost angrily, unwilling to succumb entirely to emotion. 2 nights ago, Geoffrey managed to leave the house without waking anyone. The first we knew of it was when one of the stable boys came running to the house at dawn, saying that Sir Geoffrey had been found on the moorland by a shepherd, unconscious, lying at the base of Wulfstan Tor. We brought him home, called Dr. Fenwick from the village, who examined him thoroughly and found no injury, no blow to the head, no sign of illness, nothing that might explain his state. Yet Geoffrey did not wake for 20 hours, and when he finally opened his eyes, he looked at me and whispered a single word: "Run." The room is utterly silent, save for the rain and the fire. Watson feels his heart beating heavily in his chest, the physician's mind already listing possible diagnoses, while the storyteller's soul responds to the Gothic perfection of the image. A man found unconscious at the base of an ancient tor, warning his wife to flee. Holmes moves back to his chair, settling into it with that particular stillness that indicates deep thought. His grey eyes are distant, seeing connections invisible to ordinary perception, assembling the pieces of a puzzle whose full shape remains hidden. "Your husband," he says, after a long moment, "was found lying at the base of the tor. Was there any indication of how long he had been there? The condition of his clothing, the degree of cold in his limbs, the presence or absence of dew or frost upon his person?" Eleanor blinks, surprised by the specificity of the question, but grateful for the return to concrete details, to matters that can be described without venturing into the territory of the uncanny. Dr. Fenwick estimated he had been there perhaps 3 hours, based on body temperature and the dampness of his clothing from the ground. It had not rained that night, but the grass carries heavy dew in these last weeks of autumn. His boots were muddy, suggesting he had walked considerable distance before reaching the tor. 3 miles from Blackwood Hall to Wulfstan Tor, you said? Holmes presses. Approximately 3 miles, yes, though the path across the moors is not direct. Following the established tracks would make it perhaps 4 miles. Holmes nods slowly, his fingers pressing together, and then separating in a rhythm of thought. "And in these weeks of obsessive research, has your husband shared any of his findings? Even fragments, passing comments about what he has discovered, or believes he has discovered?" Eleanor considers this carefully, her brow furrowing with concentration. "Only scattered pieces. He mentioned several times a woman named Elspeth Cairn, I believe. He said her name appeared in records from the art during the period of the Civil War, though he never elaborated on who she was or why she mattered to his investigation. And once, late at night, when he thought I had already retired, I heard him speaking aloud in his study, as though rehearsing an argument or explanation. He said something about the price of knowledge, and guardians who remain at their posts long after the need has passed. But when I entered the room to check on him, he fell silent and would say nothing more. Watson moves to stir the fire, adding another log, the action partly necessity, and partly the need for movement, for the physical act of doing something in the face of this strange and troubling narrative. The new log catches quickly, sending fresh warmth into the room, pushing back shadows that seem, in Watson's imagination at least, to have crept closer during the telling of Eleanor Blackwood's tale. Holmes rises abruptly, moving to one of the bookcases that line the room. His long fingers trace along the spines, searching, until he pulls down a hefty volume bound in dark leather, one of his many references on British history and folklore. He flips through pages with the practiced speed of someone intimately familiar with the organization of his library, pausing finally at a section near the middle. "Wulfstan Tor," he reads aloud, his voice taking on the neutral tone he uses when citing references. "Stands in northern Northumberland, 15 miles south of the Scottish border. The name derives from Wulfstan of Cheviot, a Saxon thane who held lands in the region circa 975 AD, though the stone formation itself predates human habitation of Britain. Local tradition holds the Tor sacred, associating it with various spirits and supernatural guardians. Particularly persistent is the legend of a guardian spirit or revenant, descriptions of which vary across centuries, but consistently include themes of watching, warning, and winter manifestation. He closes the book with a soft thump, returning it to its place. Brief, but confirmatory. The legend your husband investigates is old, deeply rooted in the locality, and has maintained remarkable consistency across time, which suggests either a genuine recurring phenomenon or a cultural narrative so powerful that it shapes the interpretation of ordinary events to fit its pattern. Eleanor leans forward, hope visible in her face. Then you'll help us. You'll come to Blackwood Hall and investigate this matter. I can provide comfortable accommodation, and Geoffrey would benefit enormously from speaking with someone of your caliber, Mr. Holmes, someone who approaches mysteries with reason rather than superstition. Holmes does not answer immediately. He stands before the fire, hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the flames as though reading portents in their dance. Watson recognizes this posture, this moment of calculation, where his friend weighs the intellectual interest of a case against practical considerations, where the game, for Holmes so often terms it thus, is assessed for its worthiness. "Dr. Watson," Holmes says without turning, "what is your schedule for the coming week? Any patients who cannot do without your attention for several days?" Watson considers briefly. "Mrs. Pemberton is due for a follow-up examination on Thursday, but Dr. Anstruther has been assisting me and can certainly handle that appointment. Beyond that, nothing that cannot wait or be delegated. I am free to travel if you believe the case warrants our involvement." "Oh, the case warrants involvement," Holmes says softly, turning at last from the fire to face their visitor. "Mrs. Blackwood, we will indeed come to Northumberland, though I must be clear about expectations. I am not a spiritualist, not a medium, not an exorcist of ghosts. I investigate the tangible, the material, the human elements of mysteries that others too readily ascribe to supernatural agency. If there is a ghost at Wulfstan Tor, I cannot promise to lay it to rest. But if there is a human explanation, and there is always, always a human explanation when one looks carefully enough, then I will uncover it. Is this acceptable to you?" Eleanor Blackwood's face floods with relief, the tension that has been holding her upright seeming to release all at once, leaving her briefly sagging in her chair. "More than acceptable, Mr. Holmes. Simply knowing that you will come, that you will apply your skills to understanding what is happening to my husband, lifts a weight I did not fully realize I was carrying." "When would you have us depart?" Watson asks, already mentally cataloguing what he will need to pack. Warm clothes, certainly. Medical supplies. His service revolver, just in case. Though he feels slightly foolish, considering the thought. "I have taken rooms at the Langham Hotel for tonight," Eleanor replies, "planning to remain in London for as long as necessary to secure your assistance. If it is convenient, I thought we might take the morning train northward. It is a long journey. We must change in York, then again in Newcastle. But if we depart early, we can reach Blackwood Hall by late tomorrow evening." Holmes nods decisively. "Then it is settled. Mrs. Blackwood, return to your hotel and rest. You have travelled far and carried your concern alone, but you need not do so any longer. Tomorrow morning, meet us here at 7 o'clock, and we will proceed together to King's Cross. Watson, my dear fellow, I suggest you attend to your packing, and send any necessary telegrams to your patience tonight. We venture into the borderlands, into territory where England fades into something older, where reason must contend with centuries of legend. He smiles then, a rare expression of genuine warmth, and I find myself quite looking forward to it. Eleanor rises, setting down her teacup with a gentle clink that seems to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Watson moves to help her with her cloak, settling it across her shoulders and ensuring it is properly fastened against the rain that continues its patient drumming against the windows. She thanks them both, her voice thick with emotion, restrained by English propriety, and takes her leave with promises to return at the appointed hour. Mrs. Hudson sees her out, and the sound of the street door closing reaches them, muffled but final. The two men stand in their sitting room, the fire crackling, the rain persisting, the comfortable disorder of their shared space suddenly charged with the anticipation of departure, of mysteries waiting to be unravelled in the cold northern country. Watson moves to pour them both a measure of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard, wordlessly handing one glass to Holmes. They touch them together with a soft chime and drink in companionable silence, tasting the warmth and the promise of adventure. "What do you make of it?" Watson finally asks, settling back into his chair. "Truly." Holmes swirls his brandy thoughtfully, watching the liquid catch the firelight. "I make of it what I make of all cases at their inception. Very little until I have more data. But the data itself is intriguing. A local legend, ancient and persistent. A scholarly gentleman who becomes obsessed with investigating it, and subsequently exhibits symptoms of severe psychological disturbance. Somnambulism, obsessive behavior, periods of unconsciousness. All these suggest neurological or psychiatric causes. Yet the timing, the specificity of the manifestation, the connection to a particular location, these suggest either remarkable coincidence or something more deliberately orchestrated. "You suspect foul play?" Watson asks, his medical mind immediately considering poisons, drugs that might produce such symptoms. "I suspect nothing yet," Holmes replies, "which is why the case interests me. Too often, people come with their conclusions already drawn, wanting only validation. Mrs. Blackwood comes with a mystery genuine and unresolved, with a husband suffering tangibly, but from no cause she can identify. She mentions ghosts and legends, but asks for rational investigation. That is the mark of an intellect worth respecting and a case worth pursuing." Watson nods, sipping his brandy, allowing the silence to settle comfortably between them. The clock marks 9:30, and the rain finally begins to lessen, its voice against the windows, dropping from conversation to murmur to whisper. The fire burns lower but steady, and the room assumes that quality of deep contentment that comes in the hours before sleep, when the day's demands have ended and the next day's challenges have not yet begun. "I shall miss this warmth," Watson says, gesturing vaguely at the fire, the room, the comfortable nest of civilization they are about to leave. By all accounts, Northumberland in December is a somewhat bleaker prospect. Holmes smiles, draining his glass and setting it aside. Bleak, perhaps, but beautiful in its bleakness, or so I am told, and there is something to be said for exchanging one comfort for another, trading the warmth of hearth for the clarity of cold air, the familiar streets of London for the ancient pathways of a land that remembers Rome and the centuries before Rome, where stones stand that were old when writing was young. He moves toward his bedroom, pausing at the door to look back at his friend. Pack warmly, Watson. Bring that heavy coat you purchased last winter and never had occasion to wear. And perhaps... He hesitates, an unusual hesitation that makes Watson look up sharply. Perhaps your revolver, though I trust it will prove unnecessary. Still, the borderlands have always been wild country, and it is better to be prepared. With that, he disappears into his room, leaving Watson alone with the fire and his thoughts. The doctor finishes his brandy slowly, savouring it, then banks the fire carefully for the night, ensuring it will not die entirely, but will settle into coals that Mrs. Hudson can revive in the morning. He extinguishes the gas lamps one by one, leaving only a single flame burning in the hallway, then retires to his own chamber to pack for the journey north. The night deepens over London. The rain ends finally, leaving the streets washed and gleaming beneath gas lamps that cast islands of light in the darkness. In 1,000 homes, 1,000 hearths, Londoners prepare for sleep, each carrying their own concerns, their own small mysteries and quiet griefs. At the Langham Hotel, Eleanor Blackwood lies awake despite her exhaustion, staring at the ceiling, hoping that the detective's presence will somehow break the terrible spell that has fallen over her husband, over her home, over the ancient stones that watch from the moorland. And at 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sits at his window in darkness, looking out at the night city, his mind already far to the north, contemplating legends and lies, grief and ghosts, and the thin line that separates rational explanation from the genuinely inexplicable. The pieces are in motion. The game, as he would say, is afoot. But this game plays out in slow motion, in the rhythm of rain and fire and old stories told on winter nights, in the patient unfolding of mystery that serves not to excite, but to soothe, not to startle, but to entrance, carrying the listener gently toward the borders of sleep and dream. Morning arrives in London with the particular soft greyness that characterises December days, when the sun seems reluctant to fully commit to rising, offering instead a gradual lightening of shadows, a gentle transition from night's darkness to a pale luminosity that refuses the name of brightness but provides sufficient illumination for the day's necessities. Frost has painted the windows overnight, creating delicate fern patterns on the glass that could be botanical studies or abstract art, depending on one's perspective. The temperature has dropped during the night, and the air that seeps around the window frames carries the clean sharpness of true winter, untainted by rain, promising clear skies for travelling. Watson wakes early, as is his habit, the military discipline of decades, never entirely fading, even in retirement from active service. He performs his morning ablutions with methodical care, dresses in layers suitable for a long journey northward, and descends to find Holmes already awake, seated at the breakfast table that Mrs. Hudson has laid, with her usual competence. Eggs and toast, bacon still sizzling slightly from its pan, a pot of strong black coffee sending up fragrant steam, and beside Holmes's plate, a telegraph that has arrived in the early hours. "Good morning, Watson." Holmes greets him without looking up from the telegraph, his grey eyes scanning the brief message with the intensity he brings to all written communications. "Sleep well." "Well enough," Watson replies, helping himself to breakfast and pouring a cup of coffee that he wraps both hands around, grateful for its warmth. "News." "From Blackwood Hall," Holmes says, setting down the telegraph and finally turning his attention to his own breakfast, which he approaches with that absent-minded efficiency of someone who eats from necessity rather than pleasure. Sir Geoffrey had a quiet night, according to his wife's telegram. No attempts to wander, though also very little sleep. He is aware of our impending arrival, and apparently eager to speak with us, which is encouraging. A patient who wishes to be helped is halfway to recovery, or so my limited medical knowledge suggests. Watson smiles. Your medical knowledge, limited though you claim it to be, is often surprisingly acute. Yes, a patient's cooperation significantly improves prognosis in matters of the mind. They eat in companionable silence, the sound of cutlery against china providing a gentle domestic rhythm. Mrs. Hudson appears at intervals to refresh the coffee pot, to clear plates, to wordlessly ensure her lodgers are properly fed before their journey. She asks no questions about their destination, or the case that calls them away. Years of experience have taught her that Mr. Holmes works best when not required to explain himself to those not directly involved in an investigation. But her care speaks volumes about her affection for these unusual tenants who have transformed her establishment into something far more interesting than a conventional lodging house. The clock strikes 7, precisely as a knock sounds at the door. Mrs. Hudson admits Eleanor Blackwood, who appears considerably refreshed from the previous night, though the shadows beneath her eyes suggest sleep came late, if at all. She wears a travelling costume of dark blue wool, practical and warm, with a hat pinned securely against the wind, and a carpet bag containing whatever necessities she has brought for the journey. Her greeting is warm but subdued, anxiety still evident in the tightness around her mouth. The way her hands grip her bag, perhaps more firmly than strictly necessary. "Gentlemen," she says, "thank you again for agreeing to this journey. I received a telegraph from Blackwood Hall this morning, confirming that all is in readiness for your arrival. Rooms have been prepared, and my husband awaits your consultation with what I can only describe as desperate hope. Then we must not keep him waiting longer than necessary," Holmes declares, rising and collecting his own luggage. A single battered travelling bag that Watson knows from experience contains precisely what Holmes requires, and absolutely nothing superfluous. Watson gathers his somewhat more substantial baggage, including his medical case, and the three of them make their farewells to Mrs. Hudson, who presses a paper-wrapped parcel into Watson's hands, with instructions that they are sandwiches for the train journey and are not to be forgotten in favour of inferior railway food. The street outside is bright with cold, the frost still clinging to shaded areas where the weak winter sun has not yet reached. A cab waits at the curb, its driver bundled against the chill, the horse's breath visible as white clouds in the crisp air. They load their luggage and settle inside, the cab's interior cold but better than the open air, and set off through London's morning streets toward King's Cross Station. The city passes by the windows in a procession of familiar sights, transformed slightly by the season and the early hour. Shopkeepers are opening their establishments, sweeping steps and unlocking doors. Delivery wagons rattle past, horses' hooves clopping on cobblestones. Street vendors are setting up their pitches, calling out the first tentative advertisements for their wares. London wakes slowly, reluctantly, but thoroughly, emerging from night into day with the unstoppable momentum of a great beast rising from slumber. King's Cross Station, when they reach it, is already busy despite the hour. The great arched roof soars overhead, its ironwork both industrial and elegant. Framing sky that shows through the glass panels in shades of pearl and dove. Steam rises from locomotives at their platforms, clouds of white vapour drifting upward to dissipate against the ceiling, carrying the scent of coal and hot metal and distance. The platforms are crowded with travellers, businessmen with newspapers and briefcases, families with children and excessive luggage, solitary figures like themselves, bound for destinations across the country. They locate their train, the Northern Express that will carry them first to York, and board a first-class carriage that Holmes has reserved in advance. The compartment is small but comfortable, with facing bench seats upholstered in deep red fabric, a small table beneath the window, and overhead, racks for luggage. They settle themselves, arranging bags and coats, claiming their positions for the long journey ahead. The whistle blows, shrill and commanding. The train lurches once, twice, then begins to move, slowly at first, then with gathering speed and confidence. The platform slides past, then the station's confines fall away, and London spreads out around them in all its vast complexity. Buildings and streets, church spires and factory chimneys, the great sprawling organism of the metropolis in all its grimy glory. Watson watches the city fade, giving way gradually to suburbs, then to countryside that still shows signs of human habitation, then, finally, to more open land. The rhythm of the train is soothing, a steady clickety-clack over the rails that forms a baseline beneath all other sounds. The compartment warms slowly from the heat of bodies and the thermal momentum of the locomotive, becoming a small capsule of comfort moving through the cold landscape. Eleanor Blackwood sits near the window, her gaze distant, watching the passing scenery without seeming to truly see it. Holmes has withdrawn a monograph from his coat pocket, something on the analysis of tobacco ash. Watson notes with amusement, and appears absorbed in its contents, though Watson suspects he is also observing their client, noting the small signs of stress and fatigue that no amount of rest can entirely erase. Mrs. Blackwood, Watson ventures after some miles have passed, his voice gentle, calibrated to break reverie without startling. How long have you lived in Northumberland? You mentioned 18 years of marriage, but were you familiar with the region before? She turns from the window, seeming almost grateful for the distraction from her own thoughts. No, I grew up in York, Dr. Watson, in quite an ordinary household. My father was a solicitor, my mother the daughter of a clergyman. I met Geoffrey when he came to York to consult certain records in the Minster Library, always the scholar, even then, pursuing some detail of medieval land grants with the passion another man might bring to hunting or cards. We were introduced at a dinner party, and he spoke for 2 hours about the complexities of border territories, the way land ownership reflected and influenced political allegiances. I should have been bored, but I found him fascinating. His enthusiasm, his absolute conviction that history mattered, that the past had lessons for the present if one was only willing to look closely enough. Her expression softens with memory, and for a moment the worry lifts, replaced by affection uncomplicated and genuine. We married within a year, and I moved to Blackwood Hall, which seemed to me then like something from a novel. This great stone house, rising from the moorland, commanding such views, such a sense of permanence and history. Geoffrey's father was still alive then, the old baronet, a formidable man who had very clear ideas about how the estate should be managed, and how his son was wasting his education on dusty books rather than applying himself to practical matters. Holmes looks up from his monograph, a slight smile playing at his lips. A tension as old as inherited wealth, the conflict between stewardship of land and stewardship of knowledge. I gather your husband persisted in his scholarly pursuits despite paternal disapproval. He did, Eleanor confirms, though it created difficulties. The old baronet was not unkind, but he was disappointed, and disappointment from a parent can be a heavier burden than anger. When he died 10 years ago, Geoffrey inherited not only the title and estate, but also a measure of guilt, I think. The sense that he had failed his father's expectations, that he must now prove himself capable of the practical responsibilities he had previously avoided. The train rounds a curve, and the carriage tilts slightly, the movement gentle but noticeable. Outside, the landscape has become more rural still, fields divided by stone walls, clusters of sheep huddling for warmth, the occasional farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. And has he proved himself thus? Watson asks. Your earlier description suggested a man managing his responsibilities adequately, if not with the enthusiasm of a natural land steward. He has done well, Eleanor says firmly, pride evident in her voice. The estate is in better financial condition now than when he inherited it. The tenant farmers respect him for his fairness, if not for his agricultural knowledge. The village school was rebuilt with his funding, the church roof repaired, the roads maintained. He has been a good baronet, even if his heart lies in the library rather than the fields. And he has been a good father to our children, Thomas, who is 16 and away at school, and Margaret, who is 13 and is presently staying with my sister in York, removed from Blackwood Hall for her own peace of mind, until this matter is resolved. Holmes nods approvingly. A wise precaution, removing the children from a situation that is clearly causing distress and disruption. And your staff? How many maintain the household, and have any of them observed the changes in your husband or experienced unusual events themselves? Eleanor considers this carefully. We maintain a modest staff. Blackwood Hall is large, but much of it is closed off, unused. Mrs. Thornton serves as housekeeper and cook, a position she has held for 30 years. There are 2 maids, Bess and young Annie. Samuel manages the stables and grounds with help from his son Tom. Mr. Whitby serves as butler and general factotum, though he is quite elderly now, and moves slowly. None of them have reported anything unusual beyond my husband's altered behaviour, though Mrs. Thornton mentioned that the night of Geoffrey's disappearance, she woke around 2 in the morning with a feeling of unease, a sense that something was wrong, though she heard nothing specific that would account for it. Interesting, Holmes murmurs, making no further comment, but clearly filing the information away in that extraordinary mental archive of his. The conversation lapses into comfortable silence. Watson unwraps Mrs. Hudson's sandwiches and distributes them, earning grateful acceptance from his companions. They eat while watching the landscape roll past, England unfolding in its winter aspect, beautiful in a stark way, stripped to essentials, the bones of the land visible beneath the thin covering of frost and winter-brown grass. At York, they change trains, the platform crowded and bustling, requiring them to navigate through the press of travellers, avoiding porters with loaded trolleys and children darting between adults with the particular obliviousness of youth. They locate their connecting train with 10 minutes to spare and board another compartment. This one slightly less comfortable than the first, but adequate for the remaining journey. The train departs York with the same ritual of whistle and lurching motion. And now, the landscape begins to change more noticeably. The flatlands give way to rolling hills. The hills grow steeper, the fields become smaller, and the stone walls more prominent. They are entering territory where the land itself seems to push back against human habitation, where cultivation becomes negotiation rather than domination, where the wild is never far from even the most carefully tended farm. At Newcastle, they change trains again, boarding now a local service that will carry them into Northumberland proper, into the border country. The carriage is less crowded here, the passengers fewer and more weathered, bearing that particular quality of people who live in hard country, resilient, reserved, polite, but not effusive. The afternoon is waning as they make this final leg of the journey, the sun dropping toward the horizon in a display of orange and amber, casting long shadows across the landscape. The moorland begins to dominate now, great stretches of open country where heather and gorse grow in defiant abundance, where rocky outcroppings break through the earth like the bones of the land made visible. It is beautiful, Watson thinks, but it is also alien, so different from the tamed countryside of southern England, from the intensive cultivation of the Midlands. This is landscape that makes its own terms, that allows human presence but does not bow to it. Eleanor Blackwood's mood shifts as they approach familiar territory. She sits straighter, her hands fidgeting in her lap, anxiety returning in full force now that the journey's end draws near. "We are close now," she murmurs. "Another quarter hour to the village, then the carriage ride to Blackwood Hall." Indeed, the train begins to slow, and presently they pull into a small station, barely more than a platform with a simple shelter, bearing a sign that reads Blackwood Village in faded letters. They disembark into the cold afternoon air, which carries the scent of peat smoke and damp earth and distance. The station master, an elderly man with a face like weathered oak, greets Mrs. Blackwood with respectful familiarity and helps transfer their luggage to a carriage that waits in the small yard. The carriage is well appointed, bearing the Blackwood crest on its door, a simple design of a tree with spreading branches against a chevron field. The driver, whom Eleanor introduces as Samuel, touches his cap in greeting, but says nothing, his face weathered and stoic in the way of men who work outdoors in hard country. He loads their luggage with practiced efficiency and sees them settled inside before climbing to his position and setting the horses in motion. The village slides past, a handful of stone houses, a public house called the Border Raven, a small church with a square Norman tower, a general store with a few people loitering outside who watch the carriage pass with mild curiosity. Then the village is behind them, and they are on a country road that climbs gently into increasingly wild terrain. The moorland spreads out on all sides now, vast and open beneath the sinking sun. The light has taken on that particular golden quality of late afternoon in winter, casting everything in shades of amber and rose, making the frost-tipped heather glow as though lit from within. The silence is profound, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves, the creak of the carriage, the occasional cry of a bird overhead, and then, ahead and to the right, Watson sees it, a stark tooth of stone rising from the moorland, dark against the luminous sky, commanding the landscape by sheer presence. It stands alone, isolated, perhaps 100 feet high, its sides steep and forbidding. Even at this distance, It exerts a peculiar fascination, drawing the eye, commanding attention. Wulfstan Tor, Eleanor says quietly, unnecessarily, for there can be no doubt. We pass within half a mile of it on this road. The direct path across the moor is shorter, but too rough for a carriage. Holmes leans forward, studying the Tor with intense interest. Impressive, he murmurs. One can see why it has accumulated legends. It dominates the landscape, provides a perfect focal point for supernatural narratives. And in winter, with the light failing, he trails off, but Watson understands. Even in the relatively warm confines of the carriage, even with rational daylight still providing illumination, there is something about the Tor that pricks unease, that whispers of old things and cold things and grief that has no resolution. The carriage continues, and the Tor gradually falls behind, though it remains visible for some time, its dark silhouette marking the horizon. Then the road curves, descending into a slight valley, and when they rise again, Blackwood Hall comes into view. It is exactly as Eleanor described it, a fortified manor house, its core clearly Elizabethan, built of dark stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure is square and solid, with narrow windows and thick walls, looking as much fortress as home. Wings have been added in later centuries, softening the original military austerity somewhat, adding more generous windows and decorative elements. But the fundamental character remains one of defense, of a structure built to withstand assault from the wild country that surrounds it. The house stands on a slight elevation, commanding views in all directions. A gravelled drive leads to the main entrance, flanked by winter-bare trees that form a skeletal honour guard. Lights glow in several windows, warm yellow against the gathering dusk, promising refuge and warmth after the long journey. The carriage draws to a halt before the main entrance, and before anyone can descend, the door opens and a figure emerges. A man who must be Sir Geoffrey Blackwood. He is tall and lean, perhaps 45 years of age, with dark hair going grey at the temples, and a face that would normally be described as scholarly and gentle, but currently bears the unmistakable marks of strain and sleeplessness. His eyes are shadowed, almost hollow, and his movements carry an uncertain quality, as though he is not entirely confident of his balance or his ability to navigate the physical world. But when he sees his wife, his face transforms briefly into something that suggests the man he was before whatever has happened began to happen. He moves forward to help Eleanor from the carriage, embracing her with obvious relief and affection. "Eleanor," he says, his voice hoarse, as though he has been crying or shouting, or perhaps simply not speaking much. "You're back, and you've brought—" He turns to Holmes and Watson as they descend from the carriage, and the relief in his eyes is almost painful to witness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. I am not certain I deserve your assistance, but I am profoundly grateful for it." Holmes takes his extended hand, shaking it firmly. "Sir Geoffrey, we are here to help, though you must understand that help requires your complete honesty and cooperation. Dr. Watson and I have some experience with cases that appear supernatural, but prove, upon investigation, to have perfectly rational explanations. I cannot promise to cure you of your affliction, but I can promise to pursue the truth with every resource at my disposal." Geoffrey Blackwood nods, swallowing hard. "That is all I ask. Please, come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey, and the evening grows cold." we can speak more comfortably by the fire, with food and drink to hand. They follow him into Blackwood Hall, passing through a heavy oak door into an entrance hall that speaks of centuries of habitation. The floor is flagstone, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Dark wood panelling rises halfway up the walls, topped by plaster, painted a pale cream that has yellowed with age. A staircase of dark wood ascends to the upper floors, its banister carved with acanthus leaves and heraldic beasts. Portraits line the walls, Blackwoods of generations past, their faces stern and watchful, their clothing marking the passage of centuries, from ruffs to lace to modern dress. A fire burns in a great stone fireplace that dominates one side of the hall, and before it stands an elderly man in butler's livery, Mr. Whitby, Watson assumes. He bows slightly, welcoming them with formal courtesy, and at a gesture from Sir Geoffrey, another servant appears to take their coats and hats, to see their luggage conveyed to the rooms that have been prepared. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, materializes as though summoned by thought, a woman of perhaps 60, solid and competent, with shrewd eyes and a face that has seen much and judges little. She bobs a curtsy and announces that tea awaits them in the drawing room, or dinner can be served whenever convenient, as they prefer. Tea first, I think, Mrs. Thornton, Eleanor says, taking charge with the natural authority of the lady of the house. Let us give Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson an opportunity to refresh themselves and settle in before we burden them with conversation. Gentlemen, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms. Perhaps 20 minutes to wash and rest, and then we can reconvene in the drawing room. Holmes and Watson agree readily, and they are led up the dark staircase to the first floor, then along a corridor lined with more portraits and the occasional narrow window that offers views of the darkening moorland. Their rooms prove to be adjacent, comfortable if somewhat austere, furnished with heavy wooden furniture that looks several centuries old but well maintained. Each room has a fireplace in which a fire has been laid ready to light, a bed with thick curtains to ward against draughts, a washstand with pitcher and basin, and a window that frames the wild landscape beyond the glass. Watson takes a few moments to wash his face and hands, to unpack a few necessities, and to stand at the window looking out at the gathering night. The sun has set now, leaving only a fading glow on the western horizon. The moorland stretches away into darkness, broken here and there by the tiny distant lights of isolated farms, and out there, invisible now but present in his mind's eye, stands Wulfstan Tor, keeping its ancient vigil over the land. A soft knock at the door interrupts his reverie. Holmes enters without waiting for invitation, as is his custom when they travel together. Well, Watson, we have arrived. What are your initial impressions of our host? Watson considers the question carefully. Physically exhausted, certainly. Significant sleep deprivation, possible depression or anxiety disorder, difficulty with fine motor control, suggesting neurological involvement, or simply the effects of extreme fatigue. But beyond the physical symptoms, there's something harder to quantify. A sense of a man haunted, though whether by external forces or internal turmoil remains to be determined. Aptly observed, Holmes says, moving to Watson's window to look out at the same darkness. And this house, you feel it, I'm certain. Not ghosts or supernatural presence, but history. Wait, the accumulated atmosphere of centuries of human habitation in isolation. This is not a happy house, Watson. though I suspect it has known happiness. It is a house built for endurance, not joy, and that fundamental character shapes those who dwell within it. Watson nods slowly. Do you believe Sir Geoffrey is in genuine danger? That whatever is affecting him might prove fatal if not addressed? Holmes is silent for a long moment, his profile sharp against the last light from the window. I believe, he says finally, that he is in the grip of something powerful. Whether external force or internal conviction makes little practical difference at this stage. The human mind is capable of destroying the body it inhabits, Watson. We have both seen it. Patients who lose the will to live and simply fade, despite having no physical ailment that should prove mortal. If Sir Geoffrey believes himself doomed, if he has become convinced that the weeping lady has marked him, then that belief alone could become self-fulfilling. Our task is not merely to solve an intellectual puzzle, but to break the psychological stranglehold that this legend has somehow achieved over a rational, educated man. A ghostly prescription for a non-ghostly ailment. Watson murmurs, Precisely. Now come, we have kept our hosts waiting long enough, and I find I am both hungry and intensely curious to hear Sir Geoffrey's account of his experiences. The game, as I so often remind you, is afoot. They descend together, finding their way back to the entrance hall, and thence through a door that leads to the drawing room. It is a more comfortable space than the fortress-like exterior of the house would suggest, furnished with sofas and chairs, upholstered in worn but quality fabrics, small tables bearing books and decorative objects, walls lined with more books on shelves that speak of actual use rather than mere display. A fire blazes in yet another large fireplace, and before it are arranged chairs for their small party. Sir Geoffrey and Eleanor are already present, and as Holmes and Watson enter, the butler follows with the tea service, setting it on a low table with that silent efficiency that marks excellent household staff. Mrs. Thornton appears with a 3-tiered stand bearing sandwiches, scones, small cakes, the full ceremony of English tea, that ritual of comfort and civilization that persists in the remotest corners of the realm. Eleanor pours, asking preferences for cream and sugar, distributing cups with practiced grace. For several minutes, the social ritual dominates, creating a space of normalcy, of ordinary domestic routine that provides everyone a chance to settle, to transition from the discomfort of travel and uncertainty to the potential for genuine conversation. Holmes, Watson notes, is watching Sir Geoffrey carefully, not obviously, but with that peripheral awareness that misses nothing. Their host holds his teacup with hands that tremble slightly, but noticeably, the cup chattering against the saucer whenever he attempts to drink. He manages to swallow a few bites of sandwich, but clearly eating is an effort rather than a pleasure. His eyes, when they meet another's gaze, hold an expression that Watson can only describe as desperate. The look of a drowning man who sees rescue approaching, but fears it will arrive too late. Sir Geoffrey, Holmes says gently, setting down his own cup with deliberate care, I would like, with your permission, to hear your account of what has transpired. Your wife has provided the general outline, but I need the details, particularly of your initial investigation into the legend and of your experience at Wulfstan Tor. I know this is difficult, that you may fear sounding foolish or irrational, but I assure you, I have heard stranger tales and approached them all with the same commitment to finding truth. Will you tell me what happened? Sir Geoffrey sets down his cup, his hands folding together in his lap as though to prevent their shaking. He looks first at his wife, who nods encouragingly, then at Holmes, seeming to find in the detective's calm regard some permission to speak. "I will tell you everything," he says, his voice low and strained, but growing firmer as he continues, "though I fear that when I am finished, you will think me mad. Perhaps I am mad. That would, in some ways, be preferable to the alternative. That what I experienced was real, that the legends are not merely stories, but warnings, and that I have stumbled into something that should have remained hidden." The fire crackles softly, and beyond the windows, full darkness has fallen over the moorland. Inside this warm room, with tea and firelight, and the forms of civilized comfort surrounding them, they prepare to hear a story of cold stone and ancient grief, of warnings unheeded and prices demanded. Sir Geoffrey begins to speak, and his words carry them all into shadow. "I have always been drawn to history," he says, his voice taking on a slightly distant quality, as though he speaks partly to his listeners and partly to himself, rehearsing events in an effort to understand them. Not merely the great events, wars and kings and treaties, but the smaller histories, the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary times, the way daily existence was shaped by forces beyond individual control. This region, the borderlands, has always fascinated me because it exists in a state of permanent liminality, neither fully English nor fully Scottish, belonging entirely to neither crown, yet claimed by both, generation after generation. He pauses to sip his tea, his hands still shaking slightly, the liquid trembling in the cup. 3 months ago, I came across a reference in the estate papers to an inquest held in the winter of 1643, during the Civil War, when this region was contested territory, with local families forced to choose allegiances or maintain impossible neutrality. The inquest concerned the death of a woman named Elspeth Cairn, who was found frozen to death at the base of Wulfstan Tor in December of that year. Holmes leans forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. An inquest suggests something beyond a simple accidental death. Indeed, Geoffrey confirms. The inquest record was brief but troubling. Elspeth Cairn was a young woman, perhaps 25 years of age, the widow of a soldier killed in the fighting. She left behind a young daughter, perhaps 3 years old. According to testimony, Elspeth had become convinced that her child had been stolen, not kidnapped by human agency, but taken by what the records describe only as the old powers, which I take to mean fairy folk or some similar supernatural belief common at the time. Watson finds himself drawn into the narrative, despite his rationalist instincts. The room feels colder somehow, though the fire burns as brightly as before, and the tea in his cup has ceased to provide warmth. Despite efforts to reassure her that her daughter was safe, sleeping peacefully in her bed, Geoffrey continues. Elspeth grew increasingly agitated, insisting that the child she saw was not her true daughter, but a changeling, a substitution. She accused her neighbours of conspiracies, claimed she heard voices calling her to the Tor, said she had seen a figure on the moorland, a woman in pale garments who beckoned her to follow, who promised the return of her true child if only Elspeth would come to Wulfstan Tor and pay the price demanded. Eleanor refills teacups, the small sounds of porcelain against porcelain, providing gentle punctuation to her husband's tale. Geoffrey nods his thanks, but does not drink, too caught up now in the narrative to pause. On the night of her death, Elspeth left her home. The cottage still stands, actually, at the edge of the village, wearing only her night clothing and a thin shawl. She walked the 3 miles to Wulfstan Tor through snow and freezing temperatures. She was found the next morning by a shepherd, lying at the base of the tor, frozen solid, her eyes open and staring upward at the peak, her expression described in the inquest report as peaceful, as one who has found what was sought. And her daughter? Watson asks, unable to help himself. What became of the child? Geoffrey's expression darkens. That is where the account becomes truly disturbing, Doctor. The child was found dead in her bed the same morning her mother's body was discovered. Not frozen, not injured, showing no signs of illness or violence. She simply stopped living, as though whatever animated her had departed during the night. The inquest ruled that Elspeth had died of exposure brought on by insanity, and that the child had died of grief or sympathetic response to her mother's death, though the medical understanding of the time could hardly explain such a thing adequately. Silence falls over the room, heavy and uncomfortable. Holmes breaks it finally, his voice carefully neutral. A tragic story, certainly, but similar tales of grief-induced madness and coincidental death are not uncommon in historical records, particularly during times of war and hardship. What about this specific case drew your particular interest? Geoffrey rises abruptly, moving to a small desk in the corner of the room. He retrieves a leather portfolio, bringing it back to the fireside, and opening it to reveal sheets of paper covered in his careful handwriting, photocopied documents, hand-drawn maps. Because Elspeth Cairn was not the first, he says, his voice tight with something between excitement and fear. Once I began searching, I found similar cases. Not many, perhaps 8 or 9 over the span of 4 centuries, but all following the same pattern. A death at Wulfstan Tor during winter, usually in December. A victim who had recently suffered loss, usually of a child, though sometimes a spouse or parent. Reports of hearing voices, seeing a figure on the moorland, becoming convinced of supernatural intervention. And in each case, if there was a surviving close family member, particularly a child, that person died within days, apparently of no natural cause. Holmes takes the portfolio, examining its contents with the focused intensity he brings to all evidence. Watson moves to look over his friend's shoulder, reading the careful notes, the dates and names, the accumulated pattern Geoffrey has uncovered. 1517, Margaret Ashby, found at Tor. Daughter died 3 days later. 1589, Robert Fenwick, found at Tor. Son died same night. 1643, Elspeth Cairn, found at Tor. Daughter died same night. 1701, Mary Dunstan, found at Tor. Twin sons died within the week. 1782, Thomas Blackwood, found at Tor. Watson stops, his finger hovering over the name. Your own family, he murmurs. Geoffrey nods miserably. My great-great-great-grandfather. I found his name in the family records, always passed over quickly, never discussed in detail. But when I searched the church records and estate papers, I found the full story. Thomas Blackwood had lost his wife in childbirth, and his grief drove him to the Tor during a December storm. He survived, the only one in my research who did. But his newborn daughter died the night he was brought back to the hall. Thomas himself lived another 20 years, but by all accounts he was never the same, becoming reclusive, speaking little, dying finally of what was described as melancholia. Holmes closes the portfolio slowly, his grey eyes distant, and calculating. A pattern, he murmurs. Patterns are meaningful, even when they appear supernatural. They suggest repetition, which implies mechanism, which points toward explanation. Tell me, Sir Geoffrey, what conclusion did you draw from this research? What did you believe was happening at Wulfstan Tor? Geoffrey's laugh is bitter, containing no humour. I believed it was a cultural phenomenon, Mr. Holmes, a local legend so powerful that it created a self-fulfilling prophecy. People suffering from grief-induced psychosis, influenced by the legend, acted out its narrative by going to the Tor and exposing themselves to fatal conditions. The subsequent deaths of family members I attributed to coincidence, given a pattern-seeking interpretation, or possibly to more practical causes, murder-suicide scenarios, where the historical record obscured the actual sequence of events, or illness that struck already weakened children in the aftermath of parental death. A rational interpretation, Holmes observes, and yet something changed your mind. Your visit to the Tor itself, I presume. The colour drains from Geoffrey's face, and his wife moves quickly to sit beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. He grips her fingers with visible desperation, and when he speaks again, his voice has dropped to barely above a whisper. I went to the Tor 4 weeks ago, as Eleanor told you. I went as a scholar, a researcher, with my notebook and pencil, intending to observe the site, to understand the physical characteristics that might contribute to the legend's persistence. The Tor is simply a rock formation, I told myself. Igneous stone, probably granite, thrust up by geological forces millions of years ago, shaped by wind and ice into its current form. There is nothing supernatural about geology. He stops, swallowing hard, his eyes seeing not the warm drawing room, but something else. Something that clearly still haunts him. I arrived at dawn, as the sun was rising. The moorland was beautiful in the early light, the frost sparkling like scattered diamonds, the air so cold and clean it hurt to breathe. The Tor rose before me, dark and impressive, its stone surface rough and weathered, marked by centuries of wind and rain. I walked around its base, making notes about its dimensions, its aspect, the way it dominated the sightlines from all directions. It was all perfectly ordinary, perfectly explainable. But, Holmes prompts gently, when Geoffrey falls silent. But then I heard it, Geoffrey says, and his voice breaks slightly, tears forming in his eyes, though he blinks them back angrily. The wailing, exactly as the legends describe it. A woman's voice, calling across the moorland. A sound of such profound grief that it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. I tried to rationalize it. Wind through the rock formations, some acoustic phenomenon created by the Tor's shape and position. But the wind was barely stirring that morning, not strong enough to produce such sounds. And the voice, God help me, gentlemen, the voice was not wind. It formed words. What words? Watson asks, his medical instincts warring with a growing sense that this case may prove more challenging than either he or Holmes anticipated. Geoffrey closes his eyes, and a tear escapes to track down his cheek. It called my name. Geoffrey, it said, or seemed to say, the word stretched and distorted, but unmistakable. Geoffrey, come closer. Geoffrey, I have what you seek. Geoffrey, the price is small for what you will gain. The fire pops sharply, and everyone starts slightly. Eleanor grips her husband's hand tighter, and Holmes and Watson exchange glances, the unspoken question passing between them. Hallucination? actual phenomenon? Elaborate hoax? I should have fled, Geoffrey continues, opening his eyes to stare into the fire. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to put distance between myself and that voice. But I was frozen, not physically, but psychologically, as though my will had been suspended, as though I had become merely a passenger in my own body. I found myself walking toward the tor, my hand reaching out to touch its surface. He holds up his right hand, and Watson sees what he missed before. The palm bears a strange mark, a circular pattern like frost crystals, or like the imprint of rough stone, faded now, but still visible, darker than the surrounding skin. The moment I touched the tor, Geoffrey says, looking at his palm as though it belongs to someone else. I was no longer on the moorland. I was somewhere else. I saw... He breaks off, shaking his head violently. No, that's not accurate. I didn't see with my eyes. The vision, if that's what it was, existed inside my mind, but with the clarity and detail of actual sight. I witnessed centuries compressing into moments, human lives flickering past, like pages in a book thumbed rapidly. I saw the people whose deaths I had researched, saw them walking across the moor toward the tor, saw them touched by something that cannot be properly described in physical terms. A presence, an awareness, something that existed at the tor long before humans came to this land, and that has remained fixed and patient, waiting for reasons I cannot comprehend. Holmes has risen and begun to pace, his long strides taking him back and forth before the fire. Describe this presence, he demands, not in emotional or impressionistic terms, but as precisely as you can. What form did it take, if any? What did it communicate, if anything? What was your sense of its nature and purpose? Geoffrey struggles visibly with the question, his mouth opening and closing several times, before words emerge. It appeared, if appearance is the right word, as a woman, but not human, or not fully human. Tall, impossibly tall, her form shifting between corporeal and something more like dense mist or shadow, given shape by force of will. Her face was beautiful, but terrible, ageless but ancient, expressing an emotion I can only describe as grief, so profound and enduring, that it has become something other than grief, something that transcends human capacity for sorrow, and has become its own form of existence. He looks up at Holmes, his eyes pleading for understanding, or absolution, or simply belief. She showed me things, memories, histories, the weight of centuries of watching and waiting. She is, or believes herself to be, or perhaps once was, a guardian, not of a place, but of a threshold, a boundary between what should be known and what should remain hidden. She judges those who come to the tor, who touch its surface, who seek knowledge they are not meant to possess, and she extracts a price for trespass. What price? Watson asks, though he fears he knows the answer. That which you love most, Geoffrey whispers. That which gives your life meaning and purpose. She does not take it directly. She marks it, claims it, dooms it to fade from the world, and you must watch it happen, must experience the grief she herself has experienced for countless centuries. She is not evil, I think, or no more evil than winter is evil for being cold, than death is evil for being final. She simply is, and she does what her nature demands, what her ancient purpose requires. Silence falls heavy over the room. The fire burns lower, its flames diminishing, casting more shadow than light. Outside the windows, full darkness presses against the glass, and somewhere far away, a dog howls mournfully, the sound carrying across the moorland with eerie clarity. Holmes stops pacing, turning to face Geoffrey directly. "And what did you conclude from this vision, this experience? What action did you believe was demanded of you?" Geoffrey's face crumples, despair winning over his attempt at composure. "I must return to the Tor. I must offer myself to her judgment, must pay the price she demands, because if I do not..." His voice breaks entirely, and he cannot continue. Eleanor finishes for him, her own voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Because if he does not, she will take our children instead." Geoffrey has become convinced that by touching the Tor, by seeking the knowledge it guards, he has marked our entire family. He believes that Thomas and Margaret are in danger, that unless he surrenders himself to the Weeping Lady, they will sicken and die as those other children died in the past. This is why he attempts to walk to the Tor in his sleep, why he barely eats or rests. He is being drawn back, compelled to complete what he inadvertently began. Watson moves forward, his medical training taking precedence over his fascination with the narrative. He takes Geoffrey's wrist, feeling for pulse, rapid and irregular, concerning. He notes the man's pallor, the dark shadows beneath his eyes, the slight tremor that runs through his entire frame. "Sir Geoffrey," Watson says firmly, employing the tone that has calmed countless distressed patients, "you are suffering from extreme exhaustion and the physical effects of sustained anxiety. Whatever you experienced at the Tor, whether hallucination, genuine phenomenon, or something between, your body is paying a terrible price for your distress. If you continue on this course without rest, without nourishment, without treatment, you will indeed die, not because of any supernatural curse, but from simple physiological collapse." Geoffrey looks at him with haunted eyes. "Then I will die, Doctor, for I cannot eat, cannot rest, cannot exist in any way that resembles normal life while my children are in danger. You think me mad, suffering delusions brought on by exhaustion, but the exhaustion is caused by the knowledge, not the other way around. I know what waits at the Tor. I know what I have invited into my family's existence, and I know that no amount of medical treatment or rational argument will change the fundamental reality. I must return to Wulfstan Tor and face the Weeping Lady, or everyone I love will suffer." Holmes, who has been silent during Watson's medical assessment, speaks now, his voice cutting through the emotional intensity with cool, precise clarity. "Then we shall go to Wulfstan Tor," he says simply. "Tomorrow, in daylight, with witnesses present and all possible precautions taken. If there is a genuine phenomenon occurring at that location, I will observe it and deduce its nature. If your experience was hallucinatory or induced by some external agency, natural gas seeping from the stone perhaps, or some form of contact poison affecting neurological function, then I will identify the mechanism. And if, by some possibility, I consider remote but cannot entirely dismiss, there is something genuinely supernatural manifesting at that location, then we will deal with it as intelligently and pragmatically as possible." He looks around at their small gathering, his gaze settling on each face in turn. "But we will not allow this matter to continue devouring Sir Geoffrey's health and his family's peace. Watson and I have faced many strange and troubling cases, and we have yet to encounter a mystery that could not be explained through careful observation and logical deduction. I do not believe in ghosts, Sir Geoffrey, but I do believe in the human capacity for both suffering and recovery. We will find the truth of Wulfstan Tor, and we will free you from its grip." The conviction in Holmes's voice seems to reach Geoffrey, to penetrate the fog of exhaustion and despair. He nods slowly, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. Tomorrow we will go to the Tor, and you will see for yourself what waits there. I pray that your rational methods prove equal to the challenge, though I fear they will not. Some things exist beyond reason's domain, in territories where logic holds no authority." "We shall see," Holmes replies, and his tone suggests that he does not intend to concede any territory to the irrational without a thorough investigation. The conversation winds down after this. Mrs. Thornton is summoned, and dinner is announced, a simple but hearty meal that they eat with more ceremony than appetite. Geoffrey manages a few bites, encouraged by his wife and Watson's gentle insistence. The talk turns to practical matters. What time to set out tomorrow? What clothing will be needed? Whether horses or walking would be preferable. By 9 o'clock, exhaustion has claimed them all. The long journey and the weight of the day's revelations have taken their toll. Eleanor shows Holmes and Watson back to their rooms, ensuring they have everything needed for the night, and bids them rest well with wishes that sound almost like prayers. Watson prepares for bed mechanically, his mind churning through the day's information. He stands again at the window, looking out into darkness so complete that even the stars seem dim and distant. Somewhere out there, invisible in the night, stands Wulfstan Tor, keeping its ancient vigil, guarding whatever secrets or sorrows or supernatural presences may reside at its base. A soft knock, and Holmes enters, again without waiting for invitation, carrying a small oil lamp that casts dancing shadows on the walls. He settles into the chair near Watson's fire, looking uncharacteristically thoughtful, almost troubled. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asks quietly. "Truly, setting aside our habitual skepticism, what do you think is happening here?" Watson considers carefully before answering. "I think Sir Geoffrey experienced something profound and disturbing at Wulfstan Tor. Whether psychological or genuinely external, I cannot yet say. I think the physical effects on his health are very real and potentially dangerous if not addressed. And I think—" He pauses, choosing his words carefully. "I think there are more things in heaven and earth, Holmes, than are dreamt of in our philosophies. For all our rational methods, for all our scientific progress, we remain very small creatures in a very large and ancient world. Perhaps there are places where the old things linger, where the boundary between possible and impossible grows thin." Holmes is silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "You know I cannot accept that," he says finally. "The moment we concede that supernatural explanations are valid, we abandon the very principles that allow us to seek truth. And yet—" He trails off, uncharacteristically hesitant. "I have seen things in my career that push the boundaries of the explicable. I have never encountered anything that ultimately could not be explained through material causes. But I confess that some cases have required explanations more complex than I would have initially imagined possible." "Do you believe Sir Geoffrey is lying?" Watson asks, "creating this entire narrative for some purpose we have yet to discern?" "No," Holmes says immediately. "He believes absolutely in what he experienced. Whether his belief corresponds to objective reality remains to be determined. but his subjective conviction is genuine, which makes the case more interesting, not less. A hoaxer can be exposed, but a sincere believer who has experienced something that defies easy explanation, that is a puzzle worth solving. He rises, moving toward the door, then pauses on the threshold. Sleep if you can, Watson. Tomorrow we walk across the moorland to Wulfstan Tor, and I suspect we will need our wits about us. Whatever we find there, whether natural phenomenon, human trickery, or something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about reality, we must be prepared to observe carefully and think clearly. The truth is there, waiting to be uncovered. It always is. With that, he departs, leaving Watson alone with the fire and the darkness and his own thoughts. The doctor prepares for bed finally, drawing the heavy curtains across the window, banking the fire to coals that will burn through the night, slipping between sheets that smell of lavender and feel blessedly warm after the cold of the room. Sleep comes slowly, bringing with it dreams of standing stones and ancient sorrows, of voices calling across windswept moorland, of figures glimpsed at the edge of vision that vanish when looked at directly. Watson wakes several times, disoriented, listening to the profound silence of the countryside, so different from London's perpetual background noise of traffic and voices, and the ceaseless activity of the metropolis. And once, perhaps around 3 in the morning, he wakes to hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, uncertain footsteps that pause outside his door, then move on, then descend the stairs with infinite care, as though the walker fears waking the household. Watson rises quickly, wrapping his dressing gown around himself, and opens his door just in time to see Holmes's door also opening, his friend emerging fully dressed, alert despite the hour. "Sir Geoffrey," Holmes whispers, "attempting another nocturnal journey, I suspect. Come, Watson, we must follow, but carefully. Let us see where he goes, and whether he acts with conscious intent or in true somnambulism." They descend the stairs silently, keeping well back, and watch as Geoffrey, dressed in nightshirt and dressing gown, barefoot, his eyes open but unseeing, moves through the entrance hall to the heavy front door. He struggles with the lock for a moment, his sleeping mind apparently retaining enough knowledge to manipulate the mechanism, then pulls the door open and steps out into the December night. Holmes and Watson follow, pausing only to don their own coats and boots. They are more practical than their host, even in pursuit of midnight mysteries. The cold outside is shocking after the warmth of the house, the kind of cold that steals breath and makes every exposed inch of skin ache. The sky is clear, scattered with more stars than are visible in London, the moon a thin crescent that provides almost no light. But there is light, a strange, diffuse glow that seems to come from the ground itself, from the frost that coats every surface, reflecting starlight and moonlight both, transforming the landscape into something otherworldly, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Geoffrey walks with steady purpose now, no longer stumbling or hesitating. He moves across the gravel drive, his bare feet leaving prints in the frost, then onto the path that leads toward the moorland. Holmes and Watson follow at a discreet distance, far enough back that they will not alert him should he wake, close enough that they can intervene if he appears in danger. The moorland stretches before them, vast and silver-touched in the starlight. Geoffrey walks steadily northward, taking a path that Watson cannot discern, but that his sleeping host apparently knows perfectly. The cold seeps through Watson's clothes despite his coat, and he tries to imagine what Geoffrey must be experiencing, barefoot and barely dressed, yet showing no sign of discomfort. They walk for perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps longer. Time becomes difficult to judge in the strange nocturnal landscape. And then Watson sees it ahead, darker than the surrounding darkness, a great tooth of stone rising against the stars. Wolfstan Tor. Geoffrey increases his pace, moving now almost at a run, and Holmes and Watson hurry to keep up while still maintaining distance. Geoffrey reaches the base of the tor and stops abruptly, swaying slightly, his head tilting back to look up at the stone peak invisible in the darkness above. He raises his hands, palms outward, as though greeting someone or something. His mouth moves, forming words that Watson cannot hear at this distance. He steps forward, closing the remaining distance to the tor, and places both palms flat against the stone surface. For a moment, nothing happens. Then Geoffrey's body goes rigid, his back arching, his head thrown back further still. A sound escapes him, not quite a scream, more a long exhale of breath that seems to carry his name, Geoffrey, stretched and distorted, an echo of the voice he described hearing. Holmes breaks into a run, Watson close behind, and they reach Geoffrey just as he collapses, his legs folding beneath him, his body crumpling to the frozen ground. Watson drops to his knees beside the fallen man, his fingers seeking pulse, checking for breath, his medical training overriding everything else. "He's alive," Watson announces, relief flooding through him. Pulse weak but steady, breathing shallow but present. "We need to get him back to the house immediately. He'll be hypothermic in minutes in these conditions." Holmes has moved to the tor itself, examining its surface where Geoffrey's hands touched stone. He runs his own fingers over the rock, frowning, leaning close to peer at it in the inadequate starlight. "Curious," he murmurs. "The stone is cold, as expected, but there's something, a texture, perhaps, or a slight variation in temperature where he touched it. Watson, help me get him up. We need light and warmth to examine this properly, and Sir Geoffrey needs medical attention before any other considerations." Between them, they lift Geoffrey, lighter than his height would suggest, the weight loss from his weeks of poor eating evident now, and begin the difficult journey back to Blackwood Hall. Geoffrey remains unconscious, but begins to stir as they walk, making small sounds of distress, his body starting to shiver violently as the cold begins to register. The walk back feels 3 times as long as the walk out. Watson's arms burn with the effort of supporting his share of Geoffrey's weight, and his lungs ache from the cold air he's breathing in deep gasps. But finally, blessedly, the hall appears before them, its windows dark, save for a single light that burns in what Watson recognizes as the drawing room. Eleanor must have discovered her husband's absence, and is waiting, Watson realizes, keeping vigil for his return. Indeed, as they approach the door, it opens before they can knock, and Eleanor stands there, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown, her face pale with worry but composed, ready to act rather than dissolve into hysterics. "Bring him to the drawing room," she directs without preamble. "The fire is built up, and I've prepared hot water and blankets. Dr. Watson, tell me what you need." They carry Geoffrey into the blessed warmth of the house, through to the drawing room, where the fire blazes welcome and fierce. They lay him on the sofa that Eleanor has already covered with blankets, and Watson immediately begins his examination, removing the wet, frozen nightclothes, checking for frostbite on the bare feet, wrapping the shivering man in dry blankets and positioning him close to the fire. Hot tea, not too hot, Watson directs, with sugar, several spoonfuls. We need to warm him internally as well as externally. His feet have some frost damage, but nothing that appears severe. The real danger is the shock to his system from the cold exposure combined with his already weakened state. Eleanor moves with swift efficiency, producing tea from the pot that had been keeping warm on the hob, adding sugar generously, helping Watson lift Geoffrey's head to coax small sips between his lips. Slowly, colour begins to return to Geoffrey's face, his shivering gradually decreasing as the warmth penetrates, his eyes fluttering open to focus with difficulty on the faces above him. "I was there again," he whispers, his voice hoarse and confused. "I touched the stone, and she was there, waiting. She told me—" He breaks off, his eyes widening with something like terror. "She told me the children are already marked, that no matter what I do now, the price will be paid, that I waited too long, was too stubborn, that now the grief will be doubled, tripled." "Geoffrey, stop," Eleanor says firmly, her hand gripping his shoulder. "The children are safe. I received a telegram from my sister this evening. Thomas and Margaret are well, happy, with no signs of illness or distress. Whatever you believe you heard was a dream, a hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion." "No," Geoffrey insists, trying to sit up, pushing weakly against Watson's restraining hand. "You don't understand. She showed me. I saw them, pale and fading, saw them slipping away from life like smoke dissipating, and I was powerless to prevent it, powerless to do anything but watch." "Sir Geoffrey," Holmes's voice cuts through the rising hysteria with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You will listen to me. You have been subjected to some form of influence, whether psychological, chemical, or something more exotic remains to be determined. But influence works only when the victim surrenders to it, when belief becomes stronger than reason. I am going to discover what is happening at Wolfstan Tor, and I am going to break whatever mechanism is producing these visions, these compulsions. But I need your cooperation. I need you to rest, to eat, to restore your strength, so that when I present you with the explanation, your mind will be clear enough to accept it." Geoffrey stares at Holmes, the detective's commanding presence seeming to anchor him, to provide a focal point against the chaos of his fears. He nods slowly, exhaustion finally claiming him more completely than terror. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I will try to trust in your methods, though I fear we are dealing with forces that transcend method and reason." "Nothing transcends reason," Holmes replies, but his voice is gentle rather than argumentative. "Some things merely require more data before reason can process them adequately. Now, rest. Dr. Watson will stay with you to ensure no fever develops from your exposure, and in the morning, later this morning I should say, we will all go to the Tor together, in daylight, armed with instruments and skepticism in equal measure." They settle Geoffrey as comfortably as possible, Watson administering a mild sedative from his medical bag, enough to ensure rest without rendering the patient dangerously unconscious. Eleanor sits beside her husband, holding his hand, her own exhaustion evident but overridden by her determination to keep watch. Holmes draws Watson aside, speaking in a low voice near the door. "I am going to examine that Tor more thoroughly, Watson, before full light arrives. and while the conditions are as similar as possible to Sir Geoffrey's experiences. Will you remain here with our hosts? Watson nods, though he's reluctant to let his friend go alone. Be careful, Holmes. Whatever is happening there, it's clearly dangerous. If not supernaturally so, then at least psychologically. A man could easily fall from those rocks in darkness, or succumb to cold, and no ghost would be required to explain the fatality. Holmes permits himself a slight smile. Your concern is noted and appreciated, my dear fellow. But I will take all reasonable precautions, and I am not susceptible to the particular psychological vulnerabilities that appear to make Sir Geoffrey receptive to whatever influence is being exerted. I am, as you have sometimes complained, rather too rational for my own good. In this case, that cold rationality may prove my greatest protection. He leaves then, slipping out into the pre-dawn darkness, and Watson returns to his patient, settling into a chair near the fire to keep watch through what remains of the night. Eleanor dozes fitfully, her head resting against the back of her chair, one hand still holding Geoffrey's. Geoffrey sleeps more deeply, the sedative and exhaustion combining to provide at least temporary peace. Watson sits in the flickering firelight, tending the flames when they begin to die, listening to the silence of the house and the moorland beyond. His mind replays the night's events, trying to apply medical knowledge to explain what he witnessed. Somnambulism, certainly, but sleepwalking alone does not account for the specificity of Geoffrey's direction. The apparent knowledge his sleeping mind possessed of the path to the tor, the way he responded to touching the stone. Could there be some form of local plant with psychoactive properties? Some fungus growing on or near the tor that produces hallucinogenic effects through skin contact or inhalation? Watson has read accounts of such things from tropical regions. Flowers and fungi that produce profound psychological effects, that generate visions and compulsions in those exposed to them. Or could there be, as Holmes suggested, some form of natural gas seeping from fissures in the rock? Carbon monoxide, methane, other compounds known to affect neurological function, producing hallucinations, disorientation, the sense of presence and communication with non-existent entities. These are rational explanations, Watson tells himself, mechanisms by which the supernatural can be rendered natural, the ghostly made material. Holmes will investigate, will find the answer, and Sir Geoffrey will be freed from his torment through understanding rather than exorcism. But even as Watson marshals these rational thoughts, a small voice in the back of his mind whispers doubt. He has seen things in his years with Holmes that push the boundaries of the explicable, cases where the explanation, while ultimately rational, required admitting possibilities that conventional science was reluctant to acknowledge. The world is larger and stranger than textbooks admit, full of phenomena that operate at the edges of human understanding. The fire settles, sending up a small shower of sparks, and Watson adds another log, watching the bark catch and begin to burn. The sky beyond the windows shows the first faint lightning that precedes dawn. Not light yet, but the promise of light. The slow transition from night to day that occurs incrementally, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the world is no longer dark. Watson keeps his vigil, waiting for dawn, waiting for Holmes to return, waiting to see what the day will bring and what mysteries the ancient tor will finally yield under the merciless light of rational investigation. The game continues, but in this game, the stakes are measured not in intellectual satisfaction or professional reputation, but in human suffering and the restoration of peace to a household besieged by forces it cannot understand or combat. Watson sits in the firelit room, watching over the sleeping and the worried, and prays, though he is not a particularly religious man, that Holmes's confidence is justified, that reason will indeed prove sufficient to banish the darkness that has settled over Blackwood Hall. Outside, dawn approaches, patient and inevitable, bringing with it the possibility of illumination on every sense of the word. Morning arrives gradually, as though reluctant to fully commit to the day, the sky lightening by degrees from black to charcoal to pearl. The dawn is cloudless but cold, promising clear skies and temperatures that will remain well below freezing even at midday. From the window of the drawing room, Watson watches the moorland emerge from darkness, the frost-covered landscape gradually revealed in shades of silver and brown, the heather and gorse appearing as dark smudges against the general whiteness. Geoffrey stirs as the light grows stronger, waking with a gasp and a momentary confusion about his whereabouts, before memory returns and settles over his features like a veil. Eleanor, who dozed in her chair throughout the latter hours of the night, wakes when her husband moves, immediately leaning forward to touch his face, to ask how he feels, to reassure herself of his continued presence. "I'm well enough," Geoffrey says, though his voice is hoarse and his face remains haggard. More embarrassed than injured, I think. "Dr. Watson, I apologize for the trouble I've caused. The sleepwalking, I have no control over it, no awareness while it's happening. It's as though another will entirely occupies my body, directing my movements toward that cursed Tor." Watson performs a quick examination. Pulse improved, temperature normal if slightly low, the frost damage to Geoffrey's feet minimal and already beginning to heal. "You're recovering physically," Watson tells him, "but the underlying cause of these episodes must be addressed. The human body cannot sustain this level of stress indefinitely. Something must break, either the compulsion or your health." A sound at the door announces Holmes's return. He enters the drawing room, looking none the worse for his pre-dawn expedition, though his trousers are damp from frost-soaked heather, and his face carries that particular expression of focused intensity that indicates his mind is working through complex problems at high speed. "Ah, our patient is awake," Holmes observes, moving immediately to the fire to warm his hands. "Sir Geoffrey, I have spent the past 3 hours at Wulfstan Tor, examining it as thoroughly as conditions permit. I have collected samples of the stone itself, of the lichen and moss growing on its surface, of the soil at its base. I have tested for gas emissions, temperature variations, electromagnetic anomalies, and I have made certain observations that require further investigation, but that begin to suggest a pattern, not a supernatural pattern, but a very human one." He reaches into his coat pocket and withdraws several small glass vials containing samples: grey stone fragments, green-black lichen, dark soil. These will require analysis in a proper laboratory, but preliminary examination suggests nothing unusual. The stone is granite, as expected for this region's geology. The lichen is common to exposed rock in cold climates. The soil composition is typical of moorland. No exotic compounds, no obvious source of hallucinogenic gases. "Then what explanation do you propose?" Eleanor asks, her voice tight with hope and frustration in equal measure. "If the Tor itself is ordinary, why does it produce such extraordinary effects?" Holmes settles into a chair, steepling his fingers in that characteristic gesture. I propose that the Tor is indeed ordinary, merely a rock formation that has, over centuries, become associated with a particular narrative. But narratives have power, Mrs. Blackwood, particularly in isolated communities where the same stories are told generation after generation, where the boundaries between history and legend become permeable. Your husband is a scholar, deeply invested in uncovering the truth behind local legends. When his research revealed a genuine pattern, multiple deaths at the Tor across centuries, his mind began constructing connections, finding meaning in coincidence, building a framework of explanation that incorporated supernatural elements because the pattern seemed too consistent to be random. Geoffrey starts to object, but Holmes raises a hand. Please, hear me out. You went to the Tor predisposed by your research to expect something unusual. You experienced what you interpreted as a supernatural manifestation, a voice calling your name, a vision of the weeping lady. But consider the alternative, that what you experienced was a severe anxiety attack triggered by isolation, cold, exhaustion, and the weight of your own expectations. The human mind is extraordinarily capable of generating sensory experiences that feel utterly real, hallucinations indistinguishable from actual perception when the brain is under sufficient stress. But the mark, Geoffrey says, holding up his palm where the frost crystal pattern still faintly shows. This appeared the moment I touched the Tor. How do you explain physical evidence of supernatural contact? Holmes examines the mark closely, even producing a magnifying glass from another pocket to study the pattern in detail. Fascinating, he murmurs, but not inexplicable. The pattern resembles frost crystals, you said. Consider that the stone surface you touched was below freezing, that your palm was warm, that the contact created a brief thermal exchange that essentially flash froze the moisture on your skin. The specific pattern could result from the particular texture of the stone at that exact point. The microscopic irregularities creating a template that the freezing moisture followed. It's unusual, but not supernatural. Watson nods slowly, his medical mind appreciating the explanation. I've seen similar phenomena. Frostbite patterns that reflected the texture of the materials that conducted the cold burn marks, that showed detailed impressions of fabric or metal. The skin is an excellent recording medium for such contacts. But the visions, Geoffrey insists, his voice rising slightly with desperation. I saw centuries of history, felt the presence of an entity that has existed at that location for longer than human civilization in this region. I felt her grief, understood her purpose. That cannot be explained away as frost and anxiety. Can it not? Holmes challenges gently. Sir Geoffrey, you are a historian who has spent months researching the deaths at Wulfstan Tor. Your mind is full of names and dates, of tragic stories, of the accumulated sorrows of centuries. When you entered a state of altered consciousness, brought on by fear, cold, isolation, and the powerful expectation that something would happen, your mind drew upon all that stored knowledge and synthesized it into a coherent narrative experience. The vision felt external because our own thoughts often do when they arise from the subconscious rather than conscious deliberation. But the vision's content came from your own research, your own fears, your own psychological material, rather than from any external supernatural source. Geoffrey looks stricken, as though Holmes's rational explanation somehow diminishes his experience. makes it less valid or important. Eleanor, however, leans forward, hope visible in her face. Then you're saying Geoffrey is not cursed, that our children are not in danger, that all of this is psychological rather than supernatural. I am saying, Holmes replies carefully, that I have found no evidence of supernatural activity at Wulfstan Tor, and considerable evidence supporting natural explanations for Sir Geoffrey's experiences. However, he pauses, his expression growing more serious. I am not yet prepared to declare the case solved. There are elements that trouble me, patterns that require further examination. Why, for instance, has this particular legend persisted with such consistency across centuries? Why do the historical deaths cluster in December specifically? Why do children of the victims die shortly after, even in cases well documented enough that foul play was presumably investigated and ruled out? He rises, moving to the window to look out at the moorland, now fully revealed in the cold morning light. I propose that we all rest briefly, take breakfast, and then venture to the Tor as a group. Sir Geoffrey, I want you to lead us there, to show us precisely where you stood, what you touched, what you experienced. Mrs. Blackwood, your presence will provide emotional support and another set of observations. Watson, your medical expertise and your experience with unusual cases makes you invaluable. Together, we will examine the site methodically and determine once and for all what is happening there. Geoffrey looks uncertain, fear and hope warring in his expression. I'm not certain I can go back there, Mr. Holmes. The compulsion is strong enough when I'm asleep. To go there consciously, deliberately, feels like walking into a predator's den, which is precisely why you must go. Holmes says firmly, but not unkindly. The fear has power over you because you face it alone, in darkness, in states of altered consciousness. By confronting it in daylight, with companions present, with rational methodology applied, you strip away much of its power. Fear thrives in isolation and ignorance. Light and company and knowledge are its natural enemies. Eleanor takes her husband's hand. I'll be with you, Geoffrey. Whatever is there, whatever we find, we face it together. And we have Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, who have solved mysteries stranger than this, I'm sure. Watson adds his own encouragement. I'll bring my medical bag and be prepared for any physical effects you experience. And Holmes is right. Confronting your fear directly, in controlled circumstances, is often the most effective treatment for anxiety disorders. The mind can be trained to resist irrational fears through repeated exposure that demonstrates their baselessness. Geoffrey draws a deep breath, steadying himself visibly. Very well, we'll go to the Tor, but I warn you, Mr. Holmes, what waits there is not concerned with our rational explanations or our skepticism. It simply is, and it will respond to our presence in ways that may prove challenging to your worldview. I welcome the challenge, Holmes replies with a slight smile. My worldview has survived many challenges and emerged stronger for the testing. Come, let us attend to breakfast and preparation. We depart in 1 hour. The household stirs to life as morning fully establishes itself. Mrs. Thornton provides a hearty breakfast of porridge, eggs, bacon, toast, and strong tea, served in the dining room where winter sunlight streams through the windows and makes the prospect of venturing onto the frozen moor seem less daunting. Geoffrey manages to eat more than he has in previous days, encouraged by his wife and fortified, perhaps, by the presence of his guests and the promise that answers may finally be forthcoming. After breakfast, they prepare for the expedition. Eleanor changes into a practical walking dress of heavy wool, with boots that will manage the rough terrain and a cloak lined with fur. Geoffrey dresses similarly in sturdy tweeds and hunting boots, topped with a greatcoat that adds bulk to his too thin frame. Holmes and Watson wear their travelling clothes, supplemented by scarves and gloves, borrowed from Blackwood Hall's resources. Watson checks his medical bag: bandages, antiseptics, a thermometer, smelling salts, laudanum for emergencies. Holmes packs a leather satchel with his investigative tools: magnifying glass, measuring tape, sample collection materials, a notebook and pencil, and several items whose purpose Watson cannot immediately identify, but which no doubt serve some specific function in Holmes's methodology. By 10 o'clock, they gather in the entrance hall, a small expedition preparing to venture into territory that has assumed, in Watson's mind at least, a significance far beyond its mere physical presence. It is just a rock formation, he tells himself. Ancient, yes, but no more inherently meaningful than any other geological feature. What they investigate is not the supernatural, but the human response to landscape, the way fear and legend can transform ordinary places into repositories of cultural anxiety. They set out into the morning cold, which is sharp and immediate, stealing breath and making eyes water. But the sun shines brightly, giving no warmth, but providing the psychological comfort of light. The frost persists despite the sunshine, coating every surface in crystals that sparkle like scattered diamonds. Geoffrey leads the way, following a path across the grounds of Blackwood Hall, through a gate in the low stone wall that marks the boundary of cultivated land, and onto the open moorland. The change is immediate and striking, from the ordered domesticity of the estate to the wild freedom of uncultivated land, where heather and gorse grow in defiant abundance, where the earth rises and falls in gentle swells like frozen waves, where no sound disturbs the silence except the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional cry of a bird overhead. They walk in single file initially, Geoffrey, Eleanor, Holmes, Watson, traversing a path that is barely visible, more a slight depression in the vegetation than a proper track. But Geoffrey seems to know it perfectly, following its curves and turns with the automaticity of long familiarity. Or perhaps something else. Something Watson prefers not to name. The tor becomes visible after perhaps 10 minutes of walking, appearing first as a dark smudge on the horizon, then resolving into its full impressive form as they draw closer. It rises from the moorland like a monument, like a warning, like a finger pointing upward toward an indifferent sky. The morning light renders it in stark relief, showing every crack and crevice in its weathered surface, every patch of lichen and moss that clings to the stone. As they approach, Watson becomes aware of a peculiar quality to the atmosphere. Not anything he can precisely name or measure, but a sense of weight, of attention, as though the landscape itself has become aware of their presence and is watching, waiting, judging. He shakes off the feeling, attributing it to suggestibility and the cumulative effect of Geoffrey's narrative, but the unease persists. They reach the base of the tor finally, the stone rising above them, its peak perhaps 100 feet overhead, tilted slightly as though the earth beneath it has shifted over the eons, giving it an attitude of aggressive leaning, as though it might topple forward at any moment. The stone is dark grey, almost black in places, pitted by centuries of wind and rain and frost. Up close, its surface reveals itself as less smooth than distance suggested, rough and irregular, with fissures running through it like veins, like scars, like the map of an ancient and terrible injury. Geoffrey stops several yards from the tor, his face pale, his breathing rapid and shallow. Eleanor takes his arm, supporting him, and Watson moves closer, concerned about the man's evident distress. Holmes, however, walks directly to the tor, examining its base, running his hands over the stone surface, pressing his ear against it as though listening for some internal sound. "Sir Geoffrey," Holmes calls out, not turning from his examination. "Where precisely did you touch the stone? Show me the exact location." Geoffrey swallows hard, then moves forward as though walking against a strong wind that no one else can feel. He stops at a point on the tor's western face, extending his hand but not quite making contact. "Here," he says, his voice strained. "I placed both palms flat against the stone, about here." Holmes examines the indicated area closely, using his magnifying glass, tracing the stone's texture with sensitive fingers. "Interesting," he murmurs. "Watson, come look at this." Watson joins him, peering at the stone surface where Holmes's finger indicates. At first, he sees nothing unusual, just rough granite, lichen, the general weathering. But then, adjusting his focus, he sees it, a pattern of very fine lines, almost invisible unless one looks at precisely the right angle, almost perfectly circular, perhaps 8 inches in diameter. The lines are shallow, might be natural fissures in the stone, but there's something about their regularity, their geometric precision, that suggests otherwise. "Is this natural?" Watson asks. "I'm not certain," Holmes admits, which is unusual enough to be concerning. It could be a natural formation, thermal expansion and contraction, creating stress fractures that happen to form a circular pattern. Or it could be carved very carefully by someone with considerable skill and patience. The weathering makes it difficult to determine age, but this pattern has been here for a very long time, decades at minimum, possibly centuries. Why would anyone carve a circle on a remote tor? Watson wonders aloud. An excellent question, one of several excellent questions this site raises, Holmes replies. He turns to Geoffrey, who has retreated back to his wife's side, looking as though he might collapse at any moment. "Sir Geoffrey, when you touched this spot, you experienced your vision, correct?" Geoffrey nods mutely. "And the voice you heard, it seemed to emanate from the stone itself, or from somewhere nearby." "From everywhere and nowhere," Geoffrey says, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was not a sound that travelled through air to reach my ears. It was more like a thought that appeared in my mind fully formed, but with the quality of external speech, as though someone had reached directly into my consciousness and placed words there." Holmes nods thoughtfully. "Watson, your medical training included study of auditory hallucinations, did it not?" "To some degree," Watson confirms. "Patients with certain neurological conditions, or under the influence of specific drugs, report hearing voices that seem utterly real, that they cannot distinguish from actual external speech. The brain's speech processing centers can be activated by internal signals and interpret them as external stimuli." "Exactly," Holmes says. "Sir Geoffrey, I am going to touch this same spot, and I want you all to observe carefully what, if anything, occurs. If there is some chemical or physical agent at work, some property of the stone or substance upon it that affects neurological function, then I should experience similar effects. Holmes, is that wise? Watson asks, concern overriding his usual deference to his friend's investigative methods. If Sir Geoffrey's experience was the result of some toxin or harmful agent, you might be exposing yourself to the same danger. A possibility, but I think a small one, Holmes replies. Sir Geoffrey's effects have been cumulative, developing over weeks rather than arising from a single acute exposure. And I am, as I mentioned earlier, rather less susceptible to suggestibility than most. My mind is trained to observe without interpreting, to receive information without immediately constructing narrative explanations. Let us see what occurs. Before anyone can object further, Holmes places both palms flat against the stone, covering the circular pattern that he and Watson identified. For a moment, nothing happens. Holmes stands motionless, his eyes closed, his expression neutral. Watson watches intently, ready to pull his friend away at the first sign of distress. Seconds pass. 10, 20, 30. Holmes remains still, apparently unaffected. Watson begins to relax slightly. Perhaps there is nothing here after all. Perhaps Geoffrey's experience was entirely psychological, as Holmes initially theorized. And then Holmes gasps, a sharp intake of breath that breaks the moorland silence like a gunshot. His body goes rigid, his head tilting back, his eyes snapping open but unseeing, the pupils dilated and fixed. Watson moves forward immediately, but Holmes holds up one hand in a gesture that clearly means stay back, even as his other hand remains pressed to the stone. Extraordinary, Holmes breathes, and his voice carries an odd quality, as though he speaks from very far away, or very deep within. I see. No, see is imprecise. I am experiencing. Watson, there is something here, some form of energy or residual impression, like... He struggles for words, his supremely articulate mind apparently failing to find adequate language for whatever he is perceiving. Like a recording, he finally manages, but not of sound or image, of emotion, of intention, of a mind's final thoughts impressed into the physical structure of the stone through some mechanism I cannot begin to explain. I feel grief, profound and bottomless grief, but it is not my grief. It is someone else's, experienced with such intensity that it has somehow become permanently embedded here. Geoffrey has collapsed to his knees, his own hand pressed over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor crouches beside him, her own face a study in shock and vindication. Holmes is experiencing it. The rational detective is feeling what her husband felt, which means it is real, not madness, not imagination. Holmes continues speaking, his voice strained. A woman, she lost someone, a child, I think, and her grief was so overwhelming that it severed something fundamental, broke some essential connection between spirit and flesh. She came here, to this place that was already old when she arrived, already marked by centuries of ritual, already known as a threshold, a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin. She did not die here by accident. She chose this death, performed it deliberately, using the Tor as a kind of gateway, leaving her pain embedded in its substance as a warning, as a claim, as a barrier against others who might seek to use this place for purposes she deemed improper. Watson is torn between fascination and alarm. He has never heard Holmes speak like this, never seen his friend so clearly affected by something that has no material explanation. Holmes, remove your hands from the stone. Whatever you're experiencing, it's affecting you in ways that could be harmful. Yes, Holmes agrees. but his hands remain pressed to the stone as though glued there. Yes, I should, but I must understand. There is more here, information encoded in ways that human language cannot adequately capture. She was not alone in this. Others came before her, going back centuries, millennia perhaps, all the way to... His voice cuts off abruptly. His entire body shudders violently, once, then again, and then he jerks backward, his hands coming free from the stone, and he stumbles, would fall if Watson did not catch him, supporting him until his balance returns. Holmes stands trembling in Watson's grip, his face ashen, his eyes slowly refocusing on the present, on the material world of sunlight and cold air and concerned faces. He draws several deep breaths, pressing one hand to his temple as though his head aches terribly. That, he says finally, his voice shaking slightly, was unexpected. What did you experience? Watson demands, professional concern overriding all other considerations. Are you injured? Does anything hurt? Are you dizzy, nauseous, disoriented? All of the above, actually, Holmes admits with a weak smile. But nothing that will prove lasting, I think. My mind is clearing already, though I have the most extraordinary headache. Watson, I must revise my earlier conclusions. There is something genuinely anomalous occurring at this location, something that transcends conventional explanation. The weeping lady, Geoffrey says, his voice hoarse. You felt her. You know I was not lying or mad. I know that I experienced something highly unusual, Holmes clarifies, his scientific caution reasserting itself, even in the face of the inexplicable. Whether what I felt was an external entity, a genuine ghost or spirit, or some form of recorded mental energy that can affect human consciousness when specific conditions are met, that remains to be determined. But I can no longer maintain that this is entirely psychological, or that conventional explanations are adequate to the phenomena. He moves away from the Tor, putting distance between himself and the stone, as though afraid that proximity might induce another episode. Eleanor helps Geoffrey to his feet, and the four of them stand in a small cluster, perhaps 20 feet from the Tor, looking at it with new wariness, new respect. What do we do now? Eleanor asks, her voice small against the vast silence of the moor. If what Geoffrey experienced is real, if there truly is some entity or presence associated with this place, how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our children? Holmes is silent for a long moment, his brilliant mind clearly racing through possibilities, testing theories against the new data, seeking patterns that might offer understanding and therefore control. I need time to think, he says finally. I need to research this more thoroughly, to examine the historical patterns from a new perspective, to understand the mechanism by which human consciousness interacts with whatever is present here. But my immediate conclusion is this. Sir Geoffrey, you were affected because you came here seeking knowledge, trying to uncover secrets, attempting to understand mysteries that were perhaps meant to remain hidden. The entity, I'll call it that for convenience, though I'm not convinced it's a conscious being in any conventional sense, responded to your intrusion by marking you, by attempting to extract what it perceives as payment for your trespass. But why mark him? Watson asks. Why not simply affect him directly? Why threaten his children rather than Geoffrey himself? That's monstrous, Eleanor breathes. It's grief, Holmes corrects gently. Grief unconstrained by human limitation. Grief that has outlived the body that originally contained it, and has found a way to persist through centuries. It's not evil, any more than a storm is evil. It's simply a force, operating according to its nature. Geoffrey looks at Holmes with desperate hope. Then how do we stop it? How do we protect Thomas and Margaret? Holmes meets his gaze squarely. By breaking the connection it has established with you, by severing the link that allows it to affect your family. And I believe I know how to accomplish that, though it will require your courage and your willingness to face what you fear most. Anything, Geoffrey says immediately. I'll do anything to protect my children. Even return to this tour at night and confront the entity directly, Holmes asks. Geoffrey goes pale, but his voice is steady when he replies. Even that. Then that is what we shall do, Holmes says. Tonight, at midnight, the traditional hour of power in folklore, for good reason, I suspect. You will return here, Sir Geoffrey, but this time not alone and not in ignorance. You will come with me, with Watson, with your wife if she wishes. You will touch the stone again, but this time with full awareness and with a message to deliver to whatever entity resides here. What message? Eleanor asks. That it must release its claim, Holmes says simply. That the price it demands is unjust, that Geoffrey's crime, if seeking knowledge can be called such, does not warrant the destruction of innocent children. We will negotiate with it, appeal to whatever remains of its human origin, argue for mercy, or at least for proportional justice. Watson stares at his friend, wondering if the experience at the tour has somehow unhinged Holmes's normally practical mind. Holmes, you're talking about reasoning with a ghost, with a remnant of ancient grief. How can we possibly expect rational negotiation with something that transcends rationality? Because, Holmes replies, even the most profound emotions operate according to patterns, according to logic of a kind. Grief, however extreme, is still a human emotion, arising from human experience. If we can understand its nature, its origins, its specific grievances, then perhaps we can address them. And if we cannot persuade it through argument, then perhaps we can at least complete whatever ritual or offering it requires to consider the debt paid. You mean sacrifice, Geoffrey says, understanding dawning in his eyes. You mean I must offer myself, go to the tour alone at night, and surrender myself to whatever fate the entity demands. No, Holmes says firmly. I mean nothing of the sort. Suicide solves nothing. It would merely add another layer of grief to what already exists, might strengthen the entity rather than appease it. What I propose is confrontation without surrender, communication without capitulation. We will go to the tour at midnight. We will engage with whatever is there, and we will find a way to satisfy its needs without destroying your family. And if we cannot, Eleanor asks quietly. Holmes meets her gaze, and for once his usual confidence wavers slightly. Then we will have learned something valuable about the limits of reason and the persistence of the irrational. But I do not believe we will fail. The universe operates according to laws, not always laws we understand, but laws nonetheless. There is a solution to this puzzle, a way to break the pattern that has persisted for centuries. We simply must be clever enough and brave enough to find it. They stand together on the frozen moorland, the winter sun providing light but no warmth, the ancient Tor looming above them like a judge awaiting verdict. Around them, the land stretches empty and eternal, indifferent to human concerns, patient in its agelessness. We should return to the hall, Watson says finally, practical considerations reasserting themselves. We have hours before midnight, and we should use them to prepare, to rest, to eat, to research what we can about the Tor's history and about methods others have used in similar situations. Similar situations, Geoffrey laughs weakly. Are there similar situations, Dr. Watson? Have others faced ancient entities of pure grief embedded in stone formations? Not exactly, Watson admits, but Holmes and I have dealt with cases that seemed impossible until we understood their underlying principles. We approach this as we would any case, through observation, deduction, and determination. The fact that the mystery has supernatural elements merely makes it more challenging, not unsolvable. They begin the walk back to Blackwood Hall, retracing their path across the moorland. The Tor falls behind them, but Watson feels its presence like a weight between his shoulder blades, a constant awareness that they are being watched, judged, found either worthy or wanting, by standards human minds cannot fully grasp. The walk seems longer returning than venturing out, perhaps because the initial adrenaline of confronting the unknown has faded, leaving only exhaustion and the weight of what lies ahead. They walk mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, processing what they have witnessed and experienced. Blackwood Hall appears finally, its stone walls promising shelter and safety, though Watson knows that no walls can protect against the threat they face. A threat that operates in the realm of mind and spirit rather than physical space. Mrs. Thornton meets them at the door, her shrewd eyes taking in their exhausted faces, their troubled expressions. She says nothing, merely directs them to the drawing room where she has prepared a light luncheon and has built up the fire to blazing warmth. The staff of Blackwood Hall are accustomed, Watson realizes, to their master's troubled state, to the strange comings and goings that have characterized the past weeks. They serve silently and efficiently, asking no questions, providing what comfort they can through the familiar rituals of food and warmth. The afternoon passes in a strange limbo. Holmes retreats to the library with Geoffrey, examining the historical documents again, searching for additional patterns, for clues about the entity's origins and nature. Watson remains with Eleanor in the drawing room, offering what medical and emotional support he can, discussing practical preparations for the night ahead. The sun sets early, as it does in December, the short day already fading by 4 o'clock. Darkness gathers outside the windows, and with it comes a change in the atmosphere of the house itself, a tension, an anticipation, as though the building knows what its inhabitants plan and holds its breath in sympathy or fear. Dinner is a subdued affair, eaten early and without much appetite. The clock on the mantelpiece becomes an enemy, each tick a step closer to the appointed hour, each chime marking another segment of dwindling safety. At 11 o'clock, they gather in the entrance hall, preparing for the midnight expedition. They dress warmly in layers, carry lanterns against the darkness, arm themselves with whatever tools might prove useful. Watson's medical bag, Holmes's investigative equipment, blankets and flasks of brandy against the cold. But the true preparation is mental, psychological. Each of them faces the coming confrontation with their own mixture of dread and determination, knowing that what they will encounter at Wulfstan Tor transcends ordinary experience, that they venture into territory where reason may prove inadequate and courage might not be sufficient. The clock strikes 11:30. They leave Blackwood Hall, stepping out into a night that is clear and cold and filled with more stars than Watson has ever seen. The Milky Way, a river of light across the sky, beautiful and terrible in its vast indifference to human concerns. They walk through darkness toward the Tor, their lanterns casting small pools of light that push back the night but cannot dispel it, merely create islands of illumination in an ocean of shadow. The moorland at night is transformed, no longer merely empty, but actively hostile, filled with unseen hollows and rocks that trip the unwary, with sounds that might be wind or might be something else, something watching their progress with ancient and inscrutable attention. The Tor appears ahead, darker than the surrounding darkness, a void against the stars, a monument to something older than memory. They approach it slowly, fear making every step an act of will, courage measured not by absence of fear, but by movement despite it. At the base of the Tor, they stop. Holmes checks his pocket watch. 5 minutes to midnight. "Sir Geoffrey," he says quietly, "are you prepared?" Geoffrey nods, though his face in the lantern light is paper white, his eyes shadowed and hollowed. "As prepared as I can be." "Remember," Holmes instructs, "you are not here to surrender or to beg. You come to negotiate, to communicate, to find terms that satisfy justice without destroying innocence. Watson and I will be right beside you. Eleanor will remain slightly back, but within sight. You are not alone in this. Whatever happens, we face it together." The words are meant to comfort, and they do, slightly. The four of them move closer to the Tor, positioning themselves before the western face, where the circular pattern marks the stone. Geoffrey removes his gloves despite the cold, flexing his bare hands, preparing to make contact. The clock in Holmes's pocket chimes midnight, the small sound absurdly delicate against the vast silence of the moor. Geoffrey steps forward, raises his hands, and places his palms flat against the stone, covering the circular pattern. For a long moment, nothing happens. Then Geoffrey's breath catches, his body going rigid. Holmes and Watson move close, ready to pull him away if necessary, ready to intervene if intervention proves possible. And then Watson hears it, faint at first, growing stronger, a sound that seems to come from the stone itself, from the earth beneath their feet, from the air around them, from inside his own skull. A woman's voice, wailing in grief so profound that it transcends language, so pure that it strips away all protective layers of civilized detachment, and forces every listener to feel it directly, to experience grief as an absolute, as the fundamental condition of existence. The sound grows louder, no longer a wail, but a voice. Words forming in the keening, speaking not in English, but in something older, something that should be incomprehensible, but somehow isn't, as though the meaning bypasses language entirely and inscribes itself directly on the listener's consciousness. "Who comes?" the voice demands, and it is not one voice, but many, layered across centuries, all the grief of all the lost speaking through a single channel. Who touches the stone without permission? Who seeks knowledge without paying the price? Geoffrey finds his voice, though it shakes terribly. "I am Geoffrey Blackwood. I came here seeking to understand, to uncover history, to learn the truth behind legends. I meant no disrespect, no harm. I did not know this place was guarded, was sacred, was claimed by powers beyond my comprehension." "Ignorance is no defense," the voice replies, implacable. "The boundary must be maintained. Those who seek forbidden knowledge must pay the price. You have been marked. Your greatest treasure will be taken as has always been taken, as the Covenant demands, as the ancient law requires. No, Holmes steps forward, his voice sharp and commanding. I contest that judgment. Sir Geoffrey's crime, if crime it is, was curiosity, the desire to understand. Humanity's greatest quality is its drive to learn, to uncover secrets, to push back the boundaries of ignorance. To punish that drive is to punish what makes us human. I demand reconsideration. Silence falls, so complete that Watson can hear his own heartbeat, can hear the breath freezing in his lungs. Then laughter, bitter and ancient. You demand, you, who are no more than a moment's existence against eternity, who will die and be dust while I endure. You demand of me. Yes, Holmes says simply, because while I am indeed merely mortal, brief and fragile, I possess something you have lost, the ability to grow, to change, to learn. You are trapped in grief, frozen in a single moment of loss that has been stretched across centuries. You have become your suffering, have lost whatever other qualities you possessed when you lived. I offer you a trade. Release Sir Geoffrey and his family from your claim, and I will help you find release from your own bondage. Another long silence. Watson holds his breath, hardly daring to move, aware that they are engaged in a negotiation whose rules he does not understand, whose stakes are measured in souls and centuries. You offer me release? The voice says finally, and now it sounds curious, intrigued, the implacable judge momentarily becoming something more like a prisoner, listening to talk of freedom. What do you know of my bondage? What do you understand of grief that has outlived flesh, of love that has become curse, of the covenant that binds me to this place? I understand enough to know you suffer, Holmes says, his voice gentler now. I understand that you were human once, that you lost someone beloved, that your grief was so powerful it became something other than human emotion, became a force that imprinted itself on this stone, this place, that has persisted across centuries. But persistence is not life. Endurance is not victory. You have become the very thing you hated, the power that takes children from parents, that creates new grief to mirror your own. Is that what you wanted? Is that why you bound yourself to this place? The voice, when it comes, is quieter, almost uncertain. I am the guardian. I protect the threshold. I ensure that those who seek forbidden knowledge pay the price. That is my purpose, my covenant, the reason I endure. But who appointed you? Holmes asks. Who demanded this sacrifice? Or did you simply claim the role, adopt the burden, because grief needed purpose, and you gave it one? You could release this obligation, could let go of the covenant, could simply rest. A sound that might be a sob, might be wind through stone. Rest. I barely remember rest. I barely remember anything but this. The watching, the judging, the taking. Century after century, winter after winter. Those who trespass come, and I take payment. It is all I am. Then become something else, Holmes says simply. Choose differently. Break the pattern. Release Sir Geoffrey and his family. Reject the covenant, and let yourself finally fade. Your grief has been honoured by persistence across centuries. No one could doubt the depth of your love, the genuineness of your loss. But enough. It is enough. Let it end. Silence stretches, profound and terrible. Watson realizes he is crying, tears freezing on his cheeks, though he cannot say precisely why. Whether from the cold, from the profound sadness that permeates this place, from the terrible beauty of Holmes's argument for mercy. And then, so quietly it is almost imagined, the voice speaks one last time. Perhaps it is enough. Perhaps I am tired. Perhaps rest would be welcome. Geoffrey gasps, his hands still pressed to the stone. The mark, he whispers. It's fading. I can feel it. The weight, the compulsion, the fear. It's lifting. Watson looks at Geoffrey's palm, visible in the lantern light, and sees it's true. The frost crystal pattern is fading, disappearing, as though the stone is releasing its claim, withdrawing its marking. Thank you, Holmes says softly, speaking to the stone, to the voice, to the entity that has finally chosen release over persistence. Thank you for your centuries of service, for your grief that honoured love, for your willingness to finally rest. Go now. Let go. Be at peace. The atmosphere changes, shifts, like a great weight being lifted. The air feels lighter suddenly, warmer, as though the temperature has risen by several degrees, though Watson knows that is impossible. The oppressive sense of being watched, of ancient attention focused upon them, simply vanishes. Geoffrey removes his hands from the stone, stepping back, looking at his palms in wonder. It's gone, he says, his voice filled with amazement. The connection is broken. I feel. He struggles for words. I feel free. For the first time in weeks, I feel like myself again. Eleanor rushes forward, embracing her husband, both of them crying now, but with relief rather than fear, with joy rather than despair. Watson finds himself smiling despite his own tears, relief flooding through him. Holmes stands before the tor, his hand resting against its surface, and Watson sees his friend's lips moving, though no sound emerges. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps simply a farewell to an entity that chose change over stagnation, rest over endless vigilance. They gather their lanterns and belongings, preparing to return to Blackwood Hall. As they turn away from the tor, Watson looks back one final time. In the lantern light, the stone appears merely stone, ancient, weathered, unremarkable. Whatever inhabited it, whatever awareness resided in its substance, has departed, leaving only granite and lichen, and the memory of an encounter that transcended ordinary experience. The walk back to the hall passes in silence, but it is a comfortable silence now, the silence of those who have faced something terrible together and emerged victorious, or at least undefeated. The moorland no longer feels hostile, merely neutral, merely itself, ancient earth beneath ancient sky, neither caring nor threatening, simply existing. Blackwood Hall welcomes them with light and warmth. Mrs. Thornton, who apparently never sleeps, has tea waiting and the drawing-room fire blazing. They gather there one last time, drinking tea that tastes like absolution, feeling exhaustion finally catch up with them, now that fear no longer provides its harsh energy. What happened exactly? Eleanor asks, looking to Holmes for explanation. What did you say to it, to her, that made her release Geoffrey? Holmes considers his answer carefully. I offered her what she most needed, but could no longer ask for. Permission to stop, to lay down a burden she had carried far too long. Sometimes the most ancient evils persist, not because they are strong, but because they are stubborn, because no one has given them permission to end. The entity at the tor was not evil, merely trapped by her own grief, by a covenant she had made centuries ago, and felt bound to honour, despite having long since forgotten why, by acknowledging her suffering and offering release, by suggesting that her purpose had been fulfilled and she could rest. I gave her what she needed to finally let go. Will she truly rest? Watson asks, or will she simply cease to exist? I don't know, Holmes admits. I am far outside my area of expertise here, Watson. I am a detective, not a theologian or a medium. But I choose to believe, that consciousness of any kind, whether human or something other, deserves the possibility of peace. If she has ceased to exist, then at least she is no longer suffering. If she has moved on to something else, then perhaps she will find what she sought in her original loss, reunion with what was taken from her. Geoffrey speaks, his voice steady now, no longer trembling with fear or exhaustion. I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, my children's lives, my family's future. I cannot repay such a debt, but please know that you will always be welcome at Blackwood Hall, that whatever resources I possess are at your disposal, that I am forever in your debt. Holmes waves away the thanks with mild embarrassment, as he always does when gratitude becomes too direct. You owe me nothing, Sir Geoffrey. You hired me to investigate a mystery, and I did so. That the mystery proved more complex than initially anticipated merely made it more interesting. I am gratified that we were able to resolve it without loss of life. But that is the goal of all my cases. You and your family are safe now. The Tor is simply stone once more. And I have learned something valuable about the limits of the purely rational approach to mystery. Sometimes compassion and imagination are as important as logic and evidence. The conversation winds down as exhaustion finally claims them all. They make plans for departure. Holmes and Watson will remain one more day to ensure Geoffrey shows no relapse, then return to London by the evening train. Geoffrey will write to his children, reassuring them and inviting them home for Christmas, which is now only 2 weeks away. Life will return to normal, or as normal as life can be, for those who have confronted the genuinely inexplicable and emerged changed by the experience. Watson finally retires to his room, his body aching with exhaustion, his mind still processing the night's events. He stands once more at his window, looking out at the moorland visible in the starlight, at the distant dark shape of Wulfstan Tor marking the horizon. Rest well, he murmurs to the night, to the entity that may or may not still exist in some form, to all the grief and loss that has accumulated in this ancient landscape. You've earned it. He draws the curtains finally, shutting out the night and the cold and the wild country. He prepares for bed and slips between the sheets, feeling the day's tension finally releasing its grip on his body and mind. Sleep comes quickly now, without dreams of voices or standing stones or ancient sorrows. Just deep, restful darkness and the promise of dawn waiting patiently on the other side of night. Morning comes gently to Blackwood Hall, the winter sun rising late and without urgency, casting long shadows across the frost-touched moorland. Watson wakes naturally, without alarm, and realizes with surprise that he has slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time since arriving in Northumberland. The house feels different this morning, lighter somehow, as though a weight that no one consciously acknowledged has been lifted. He dresses and descends to find breakfast already laid out in the dining room, and his companions gathering with expressions that mirror his own sense of relief and recovery. Geoffrey looks transformed, still tired, still bearing the physical toll of his weeks of torment, but with colour in his face and clarity in his eyes that had been absent before. Eleanor moves with a lightness of step that speaks of burdens released, and even Holmes seems more relaxed, less driven by the relentless energy that usually propels him through cases. They eat breakfast together, conversation flowing easily now, no longer weighted by dread or uncertainty. Holmes recounts other cases they have worked, selecting those with happy resolutions and avoiding the darker narratives that also populate his career. Geoffrey speaks of plans for renovating portions of the hall that have been neglected, of scholarly projects he looks forward to resuming now that his mind is once again his own. After breakfast, Holmes proposes a final visit to the Tor, not to interact with it, but simply to observe it in daylight, to confirm that the change they all felt last night was genuine and lasting. They set out together, the four of them, walking the now familiar path across the moorland. The day is cold but beautiful, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds, the frost sparkling in the sunlight like scattered gems. The moorland extends in all directions, empty and peaceful, and Watson realizes he has come to appreciate its stark beauty, its refusal to be anything other than exactly what it is. The Tor rises ahead, and as they approach, Watson searches his feelings for any return of the unease, the sense of oppressive attention that characterized previous visits. He finds none. The Tor is simply stone, ancient, weathered, impressive in its own right, but no longer pregnant with threat or supernatural significance. They stand at its base, looking up at the peak, and Holmes reaches out to place his hand on the stone surface where Geoffrey touched it last night. He stands thus for a moment, eyes closed, then removes his hand and nods. Nothing, he says with satisfaction. No residual energy, no sense of presence, no lingering effects. Whatever was here has truly departed. The Tor is simply a geological formation now, remarkable only for its age and prominence, no longer serving as a threshold or being inhabited by ancient grief. Geoffrey also touches the stone, tentatively at first, then more confidently. He smiles, genuine and relieved. I feel nothing but cold granite. It's over. It's truly over. They stand together for a few minutes more, paying silent respect to the place and what it represented, to the entity that chose release over persistence, to all the sorrow that has finally been laid to rest. Then, by mutual unspoken agreement, they turn away from the Tor and begin the walk back to the hall. The day passes in pleasant domesticity. Holmes and Watson prepare for their departure, packing their belongings, settling accounts with the household. Geoffrey shows them his library, pointing out volumes that might interest them, offering to loan anything they wish to take with them to London. Eleanor ensures they have provisions for the journey, and extracts promises that they will return for a visit when the moorland wears its summer colours rather than its winter frost. By late afternoon, the carriage is ready, their luggage loaded, farewells said to the staff who have served them so well. Mrs. Thornton presents them with a basket of food for the journey, baked goods and fruit, and a bottle of elderflower wine from the hall's own stores. They embrace their hosts, a familiarity earned through shared ordeal, and promise to write, to stay in contact, to remember their time in Northumberland. The journey back to London reverses their arrival. Carriage to the village station, train to Newcastle, change of trains to York, final connection to King's Cross. Watson watches the landscape pass by the windows, the moorland giving way to more cultivated country, the wild giving way to the tamed, and feels a small pang of regret at leaving, mixed with relief at returning to familiar territory. They reach London as evening settles over the city, the metropolis wrapped in its usual pall of fog and smoke. gas lamps beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. A handsome cab carries them back to Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson greets them with her usual perfect balance of welcome and disinterested competence, confirming that their rooms are ready, that supper will be served within the hour, that several letters await Mr. Holmes's attention. Watson and Holmes settle back into the sitting room, the fire rebuilt and crackling, the familiar comfort of home enfolding them after their northern expedition. They sit in their accustomed chairs, Watson in his, Holmes in his, and for a while neither speaks, simply absorbing the return to normalcy. A remarkable case, Watson finally says, breaking the comfortable silence. One of the strangest we've encountered. Indeed, Holmes agrees, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. And one that challenges certain fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the limits of the explicable. I find myself uncertain how to categorize it in my records. Solved, certainly, but solved through means that sit uncomfortably with my usual methodology. You were magnificent, Watson says quietly. The way you negotiated with the entity, the compassion you showed to an ancient grief, the eloquence with which you argued for release rather than punishment. I've never seen you quite like that. Holmes looks mildly embarrassed, as he always does when his deeper emotions are acknowledged. I simply did what the situation required. Logic alone was insufficient to resolve the matter, so I employed what small understanding I possess of human nature and emotional truth. That it proved effective was perhaps more luck than skill. I think not, Watson counters. I think you recognized what the entity needed on a level deeper than pure logic, and you provided it. That is a gift, Holmes, one perhaps more valuable than your powers of observation and deduction. Holmes waves the comment away, uncomfortable with the praise. In any case, the matter is resolved. Sir Geoffrey and his family are safe. The tour is simply stone once more, and we have returned to London with another strange tale to add to the collection. You'll write it up for publication, I assume. Watson considers. Perhaps, though I'm not certain readers would believe it. A ghost that proved genuine, that was negotiated with rather than dismissed, that chose to release its hold through compassion rather than force. It reads more like a fairy tale than a detective story. Then frame it as a story told beside the fire, Holmes suggests. A tale for winter nights, something to help listeners drift toward sleep rather than jolt them awake with excitement. There is value in such stories, Watson. They remind us that the world is larger and stranger than our waking minds typically acknowledge, that there is room for wonder alongside reason, that not all mysteries require solving so much as they require understanding. Watson nods slowly, the idea taking shape in his mind. A fireside mystery, a story that soothes rather than startles. Yes, that might work. I can imagine the telling of it, the slow unfolding of the narrative, the journey north, and the confrontation at the tour, the resolution through compassion rather than violence. It would be different from our usual published cases, but perhaps all the more valuable for that difference. Write it as you see fit, Watson, Holmes says, closing his eyes and sinking deeper into his chair. You always do, and you always find the story's heart, the human element that makes these cases more than mere puzzles. That is your gift, complementing my methods. Together, we make a complete account, the logic and the heart, the observation and the emotion. The fire crackles softly, and the gas lamps glow warm in the comfortable sitting room. Outside, London continues its endless activity, but here, in this sanctuary of friendship and shared experience, peace reigns. Watson picks up his pen and notebook, feeling the story already beginning to form, the words arranging themselves in patterns that will carry readers north to wild country, into confrontation with ancient grief, through to resolution and return. He begins to write, capturing the journey while it remains fresh, preserving the details that will become the skeleton on which the full narrative will be built. Holmes dozes in his chair, the great detective allowing himself a rare moment of complete relaxation, secure in the knowledge that a mystery has been solved, a family saved, a wrong righted. The clock on the mantelpiece marks time, but gently, without urgency, it's ticking a soft heartbeat, underlying the evening's peace. And so the story concludes, not with excitement or drama, but with quiet satisfaction, with the return to normalcy that is sometimes the greatest gift a detective can provide to those who seek his help. The winter's tale is told, the Banshee's wail has faded into silence. And in 221B, Baker Street, by the fire's warm light, two friends sit together in companionable silence, ready to rest, ready to dream, ready to face whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring. Dear friends, we have reached the end of our journey together tonight, walking with Holmes and Watson across the frozen moorland, standing with them before the ancient Tor, witnessing their confrontation with a grief that had outlived the body that originally contained it. Thank you for accompanying them, for lending your imagination to this tale of winter and mystery, of reason and compassion, of the strange and wonderful boundary where the explicable meets the genuinely inexplicable. If you have enjoyed this fireside mystery, this slow-paced journey into the Gothic heart of Victorian England, I hope you will let me know by liking this story, by subscribing to see more tales like this one, stories crafted not to startle, but to soothe, not to excite, but to enchant, narratives designed to help you drift gently toward sleep, while still engaging your imagination and curiosity. Perhaps next time we will venture to other mysterious places, to foggy London streets where strange sounds emerge from shuttered houses, to ancient abbeys where the past refuses to remain entirely past, to isolated villages where local legends prove more true than anyone anticipated. There are so many stories yet to tell, so many mysteries yet to explore, all of them perfect companions for the quiet hours between waking and dreaming. For now, though, let this story settle into your mind like snow falling softly on moorland, like frost forming delicate patterns on window glass, like the last embers of a fire glowing warm in the darkness. Let the rhythm of the narrative carry you gently down toward sleep, toward dreams of ancient stones and winter stars, of voices calling across empty country, of compassion offered and accepted, of rest finally earned after centuries of vigilance. Sleep well, dear friends. Rest peacefully. Know that the mysteries of the day will wait patiently for morning, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to lay down our burdens and allow ourselves to rest. Good night. Until we meet again beside the fire, until another tale needs telling, until the next mystery calls for our attention. Good night, and sweet dreams. The hearth light fades, the story ends, and sleep, gentle and welcome, wraps its quiet arms around us all.